Good afternoon. Today is Tuesday, April 6th, 2021. We are back from spring break. Hopefully you are well rested and well recovered. My Monday class started at 8 o'clock yesterday and none of us wanted to be there, but hopefully this group will be a little bit more lively. It's always scary when the schedule gets short. So that means we're getting closer and closer to the exam, and that is indeed the case. We have our next exam 1 week from today. Between now and then, we still have a ton of material to cover, less so in the lecture standpoint, and more so we have some catching up to do on our O's, A's, and I's. So we have that. You do still also have 2 assignments. Hopefully you spent some time on this spring break, your Unit 11 review, and also your muscle activity handout, which remember will be graded for correctness. Like I said, all leading up to 1 week from today when you will have your 4th lab and lecture exam, and then we start the nervous system, and then we're done. Just that quickly, we are rapidly approaching the end of this class. All right, so any questions on that before we get started? Excellent. Stunned silence is my faves. All right, then let's.
I have a question. It's not pertaining to what you just said, but the Physio X exercises, are you planning on covering those same subjects? Because I found a lot of them insufficient in the 2 pages they explain for the procedure. I couldn't fully understand the concepts I was learning, and we haven't covered all of them in class yet. Are you going to expand on those, or am I on my own?
So we will, well, you're never on your own. We will discuss some of those. Again, we are in the process of building up, but again, the point of that isn't to be completely repetitive. So what I would suggest is if there are parts you are unfamiliar with or unclear on, then the best thing to do is take advantage of my office hours, take advantage of emailing me to ask me those questions, preferably before it's due, so that you can get more out of actually doing the activities. I remember the PhysioX themselves also have refresher information. If you're unclear on the concepts, they've got resources that you can use for that. But you are absolutely responsible for all the material that we'll cover there. Much of the material will overlap with what we're talking about in class, but my goal isn't going to be to take the time to go through the whole PhysioX thing together, because that's the point of doing it at home. But absolutely, if you're unclear about something or not understanding some of the concepts, then yes, by all means, ask me about them. All right. Any other questions? All right. We left off last time, and we have been in the process of building our way back up. We broke our muscle cell down to its most basic components, those proteins, and we saw how those proteins interacted. And then we built them back into a sarcomere and saw how that sarcomere interacted, and put them in a myofibril and saw how that myofibril interacted. And then we even looked at a single muscle cell and looked at the ways we could change tension within a single muscle cell. And that's where we left off last time. However, even if I'm lifting something as little as this pen, I'm typically not going to rely on just one muscle cell to do that. When it comes to moving the parts of our body through space, we use muscles together. And to do that, we use a structure, a component known as a motor unit. A motor unit is basically made up of a single somatic motor neuron and all of the muscle cells that it innervates. Here we have a nice illustration from your textbook, but let's do an even simpler one than this. Let's come to our whiteboard. On our whiteboard here, let's go ahead. Let's do that. And throw 6 muscle cells in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we'll pretend those are all the same size. Spread them out a little bit more. Oops. Nope. That's what I need. There we go. So let's say this is one fascicle, and this fascicle happens to have 6 muscle cells in it. We are going to have neurons somatic motor neurons. So let's remind ourselves of that. That are going to communicate with them. And we've briefly talked about the anatomy of a neuron. We know that a neuron, for instance, has a typical neuron has a single cell body, large centrally located, several small branching dendrites coming off of it, and a long axon that comes off of it that allows it to form a synapse with its synaptic end bulb with the motor end plate of a single muscle cell. And what do we call this specialized region of communication? What's the generic name for it?
Neuromuscular junction?
Well, that is the specific name for it. It absolutely is the neuromuscular junction. What would the generic name for an area of communication between a neuron and its target cell be?
A synapse?
Exactly, a synapse. And one of the important things to remember is that all muscle cells have one and only one synapse on them. So each muscle cell only receives information from one somatic motor neuron. However, does a somatic motor neuron just need to communicate with one muscle cell? Well, I'm asking the question, so what's the obvious answer? Yeah, exactly. The obvious answer is no. In fact, remember, as we talked about, that axon is a single unbranched structure, but it does have the ability to branch to form those axon terminals, which would allow it to form synapses with two or more muscle cells. And let's draw one more.
What are those little spikes on each neuron?
Those are the dendrites. Remember, as we said, neurons, and again, we haven't talked too much about the anatomy of neurons. We just did it very briefly. But neurons have many elaborate branches, short elaborate branches coming off of them called dendrites, where they receive information. And then they send information out the axon. So they get information and then they send information. And they have two different processes. Processes, remember, something that sticks off of that does that. Exactly. Three very ugly looking and very colorful suns, but you get the right idea. What we have is three motor units now is what we have. And remember, those are the somatic motor neurons and all of the muscle cells that they connect to. And there's one other important rule to know about a motor unit. That rule is when a somatic motor neuron fires, all of the muscle cells that it communicates with excite, contract, and relax at the same time. So basically, all the muscle cells work together. And clearly, you can see the advantage of this. Let's say this was my bicep brachii. Yes, Lori, you had a question?
Yes. So I was reading through the book and it says muscles that have that control smaller things like your fingers and your eyes have less somatic motor neurons. Does that or am I understanding correctly? It has less.
You are absolutely understanding correctly. And again, we're going to build to that. But notice if you look at my really simple example here, I have three somatic motor. I have three motor units here, three somatic motor units here. But notice each of them is a different size. One only communicates to one muscle cell, one communicates to two, and one communicates to three muscle cells. So you're absolutely right. Depending on what type of activity I need, if my goal is to lift this pen, when I go to lift this pen versus when I go to lift up my couch, do I contract the muscles in my arm all at the exact same rate and the exact same strength to lift a pen as I do to lift the couch?
No.
No, I'm going to want to use different motor units. I'm going to want to use different number of muscle cells to be as efficient as possible. And let's be really simple. If I wanted to lift this pen in my arm, the fascicle with these 6 muscle cells was in my bicep brachia, and I wanted to flex my elbow and lift a single pen, and it took one muscle cell to generate enough force to lift a pen, which of my 3 motor units would I use?
The one with only one axon,
And what color is that?
the purple.
Purple. And yeah, here we can label them if that makes it easier too. So this will be A, this will be B, and this will be C. Okay, what if instead I wanted to lift 2 pens?
B.
Yeah, exactly, I could use B. What if I wanted to lift 3 pens?
C.
C. What if I wanted to lift 4 pens?
Would it still be C?
Well,
Or-
if each pen takes one muscle cell to use, would it be possible to lift 4 pens, or am I just screwed? I can't lift 4 pens.
Or all at the same time?
Well, do I necessarily need to do all of them at the same time to lift 4?
No.
What do I need to do?
You can use 2.
Which
A and
ones?
B.
The last 2, B and C.
Well, how many would that give me?
Oh, okay. And
A
okay.
and C?
A and C. There you go. A and C would allow me to lift 4. What would allow me to lift 5?
B and C.
What would allow me to lift 6?
All 3.
All 3. And what if I wanted to lift 7 pens?
It would be a smaller somatic motor neuron.
Well,
Purple.
with this muscle and this number of muscle cells, would I be able to lift 7 pens?
Oh, no.
No. Notice 6 is the maximum I would be able to lift. So notice by varying the motor units that I fire, I can change how much strength I am generating to lift different amounts of items as efficiently as possible. So that when I go to lift just a single pen, I don't have to completely exhaust my arm muscles to be able to do that. I can just use that single motor unit for a single muscle cell to be able to do that. I'm not sure I understand the question, Ariel. We have these types of motor units throughout our body. All right.
So each so we have all 3 throughout our body. It's just depending on when we need all 3, we'll use all 3.
No, what we have within the fascicles and within the muscles of our body is it's not like my bicep brachia just has one nerve that tells all of the muscle cells of my bicep brachia what to do. I have many motor units that communicate to it. So depending on how much strength I need to produce, if I just need to produce a little bit of strength, I can use a smaller motor unit. If I need to produce a medium amount of strength, I can use a slightly larger motor unit, an even more motor unit. And then if I need to go beyond, then I can add 2 or 3 motor units together to generate more and more tension. And notice there is an ultimate maximal tension I can produce with these motor units. Once I have all the muscle cells firing, then that's all the tension. That's the maximal tension I'm going to be able to generate. Yes, question.
Yeah, so each muscle cell can only have one motor neuron attached to it, but
Yes.
motor neurons could have many different axons.
Exactly. In fact, the average motor unit is about 150 muscle cells. So a single somatic motor neuron on average talks to 150 muscle cells. So when it fires an action potential, 150 muscle cells all fire together. But again, that's on average, right? There's 21 people in this class right now. What is the average height for a female?
I think
5'7",
Yeah, or
5'7".
something like that.
Five,
In a group this small, is it likely that we have 2 females that are 5'7"? Exactly the precise average height of a female?
No.
And it's even less likely with males because there's so many fewer males in this class, right? Exactly. It's likely that people are going to be smaller and larger. And it's the same thing for motor units. This is an average. There are some motor units, as I don't remember who was asking the question. Was it Laura who was doing the reading? For instance, if you're doing precise movements like with the hands, or I think this may be where you were going with the eyes, small precise movements, those small precise movements, a single motor unit may be communicating with as few as 4 muscle cells. That if only 4 muscle cells fire, you're not getting a massive amount of strength. But what you are getting is precision, which is going to allow you to thread that needle, right? However, if you have to kick that game-winning field goal, you need a much more powerful movement. And so for that, you want hundreds, if not thousands of muscle cells all firing together so that they give you the massive power necessary to send that ball flying through the air. But it isn't necessarily, if you got 1,000 muscle cells all firing together, that isn't necessarily going to be the most precise thing in the whole wide world.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
I don't want to get too off topic, but so say you are very active and your muscles work past the maximum. Is it basically just training those muscles to lift heavier, or are you producing more somatic motor units? I don't know if that makes
Okay,
sense.
I know exactly. I understand exactly what you're saying. And so you're talking about like with practice, with exercise, how we gain strength.
Yes,
Right?
like wait.
Exactly. So what I would say to that is it is impossible to go beyond your maximum. Right. Again, the physics of it is you only have so many myosin and actin, and when you have all of them engaged, you are going to reach some maximal strength, and that is going to be the top force that you're able to generate. Now, typically when we are exercising or when we're running or we're doing all of these things, fatigue and other stuff set in. We also have some other protective measures in place that discourage us from reaching that maximum all the time. Right? We talked about how, like in the last class, typically when a muscle cell is firing to be able to move something through space, it's not firing at its maximal intensity. It's not producing its maximal tension because it's more likely to be damaged. So we had that unfused tetanus where it typically works at. However, is it possible that we could train the muscle to move beyond that to reach its peak? Yes, we can't go beyond the peak, but we could go beyond what we normally do and reach a peak. But here's the other thing too. And again, I like to use this example because it's near the end of the semester and we're all exhausted. And so as a result of this, we may decide to just chuck all this. And instead of, talking for 4.5 hours a day, we decide to work out for 4.5 hours a day. After doing that for 2 weeks, will you be stronger? Will you be able to lift more weight than you were able to do today if you worked out 4.5 hours a day for the next 2 weeks?
Yes.
Absolutely. Would it be because you became absolutely yoked and were massive after just 2 weeks of working out?
No.
No. The reason you see that first initial increase in strength isn't because you're adding massive amount of muscle cells or massive amount of even proteins. What actually is happening is you're getting more efficient at using your motor units.
Progressive overload.
Well, not just that, but remember also, it kind of goes back to the example we talked about at the beginning of this section. I could put any 4 of you into a boat and give you oars, and you would be able to get from one side to the other of a lake, right?
Yeah.
But you guys wouldn't be able to beat a crew team, right? Assuming it wasn't Lori Lofton's kids, you guys would get beat by a crew team. It isn't necessarily that the crew team is bigger and stronger than you guys are. They could be the exact same size as you. However, they have practiced and they have coordinated and they have become more precise and therefore more efficient in their movements. And that coordination and that efficiency makes them go faster, stronger. And so when that first initial increase in efficiency, infants of strength or speed that you get really comes more from organizing your motor units and being more efficient at the use of your motor units. And then with time, you're adding more proteins and adding to your muscles and adding more strength that way as well. All right.
I have a quick question that's not fully relevant, but my husband and his friends like to rock climb, and occasionally I go with them, and I am so sore the next day in the randomest spots where I didn't even know I have muscles. Is it because I don't normally use those muscles every day, or why?
Yeah, absolutely. You're doing an activity that you aren't normally doing, so you're likely using muscles that you don't normally use in normal everyday life. Absolutely. And we'll talk about fatigue and what caused that soreness a little bit later. We will get to that today. All right. Let's look at one more example, a little bit more sophisticated than the one that I have, that I drew. Notice it's got more muscle cells. And if you bother to count, you'll see that in this case, unlike mine, we do indeed have 3 motor units, but all the 3 motor units are about the same size. Obviously, that means that they would be able to produce the similar amounts of strength. What's the advantage of having motor units that are similar in size?
They can all work at the same time and help aid in using more force.
True. But again, even if they were different sizes, if I was using them all at the same time, they'd all be firing and I'd be able to make the same amount of strength, whether they were same in size or whether they're different in size. It's actually kind of the opposite, right? Back in elementary school, I grew up back east, and back east is very, very different from California for those of you who have never been there. And in 4th grade, when we got in trouble, we had to go up to the principal's office. And when you went up to the principal's office, he would get you would get down on your knees and you would put out your arms, and he would put a textbook in each one of your hands. And you had to hold those textbooks up until he got tired. If you were able to hold those textbooks up until he got tired, you got to just go back to the classroom and your punishment was over. If you could not hold them up until he got tired, you got swatted and then sent back to the classroom. All right. Now, how many of us, myself included, were able to hold those books up until the principal got tired? I know I wasn't able to, right? But let's think about it in this pen instead. As I talked about, if it just takes one muscle cell to hold this pen up, do I just continue to fire the same muscle cell over and over and over and over and over and over and over again to keep this pen up?
No.
No, if I do that, that cell's going to get exhausted. All my other cells are doing nothing, and my arm's going to fall. But if I can rotate through motor units, firing first one, and then the second, and then the third, and going through it that way. Again, you got to remember, this was the early 1800s. It was a very different time in our lives when this was happening. All right. The being able to cycle through the motor units helps to stave off fatigue, allowing you to do an activity. So even having similar size motor units can be important because it helps you to maintain activity and stave off fatigue by cycling through them. Now, what if I have, we talked about how I have all the different pens and how many which motor units I need to lift them. But what if the pens are in a bag and I don't know how many pens are actually in the bag? Am I able to lift that bag even if I don't know how many pens are in it?
Yes.
Yeah. And the reason for that is a process called recruitment. I have a bag with a random amount of pens in it. And what happens is I grab it and I start to lift it. When I start to try to lift it, it turns out the smallest motor units are the ones that get stimulated first. So I try to lift it with the one motor unit that can lift one pen. And if I'm able to lift it, boom, end of story, I'm done. However, if I can't lift it with that first motor unit, then I will fire a second, and I'll fire a third, and I'll fire a fourth motor unit until I'm finally able to produce enough force to lift that bag of pens.
Is that why sometimes you think something is heavy and you go and pick it up and it's completely light?
Absolutely. We're usually really, really good at this. We're really good at guesstimating how much something weighs and using our muscles appropriately to do that. Like the bag of groceries. But then you go to grab the bag of groceries, not realizing that your wife has taken 4 big cans of beans out of it. So you go to pick it up thinking that it's going to be heavy, and instead it flies through the air. Or the opposite is true. You go thinking that it's going to be light, and someone has put 10 cans of beans in there, and suddenly you struggle with it because you don't anticipate it. Absolutely. We're really good at guesstimating how much things weigh and how much recruitment is necessary. And that's what we're seeing here. Notice with this simple illustration, first we have no motor units firing, then our first motor unit fires. That's way too big. Our first motor unit fires. It's the smallest one. It produces a small amount of tension. Then notice here's our first one again, and we recruit our second, which has 3 to it, and we get a little bit more, and so on and so forth, and it gets more and more until we are firing all the muscle cells in a fascicle. When we are firing all the muscle cells in a fascicle, then that is going to be the maximal tension we're going to be able to produce in that muscle, in that fascicle. And remember, as we talked about, typically we fire these asynchronously because if I want to produce some tension to hold that book up, I'm not just going to use my orange motor unit and just keep firing it again and again and again and again and again. I'm going to asynchronously cycle through them, and that allows me to produce a relatively high and stable amount of tension without overly fatiguing the muscles. It's why I can hold this pen up for much, much longer than I could hold up one of my kitchen chairs, right? If I was trying to hold up one of my kitchen chairs, I would need to be firing more of my motor units at the same time to produce enough tension to hold them up, and I'm not able to cycle through them. And if the less I can cycle through them, the faster I'm going to fatigue. So if I try to hold that kitchen chair up, I'm going to drop it much sooner than I'm going to drop this pen. So you increase recruitment to reach the maximal tension necessary to either move it or the maximal tension, right? If I go outside and try to lift my car, I'm going to produce the maximal tension, but the car is not going to move. No, remember the fused tetanus is what is happening in a single muscle cell. Remember, with recruitment, we're using many muscle cells.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate your faith in me, but I've got a big old huge Mazda, SUV, so I'm not moving that. I might be able to move my wife's car. She's got one of those little minis, but I'm definitely not moving mine. Yeah, she got that with her midlife crisis. Cute little mini. All right, excellent. But even that, I think I'd have trouble moving. All right, excellent. So now we know how to change the tension in a single muscle cell. We know how to recruit muscle cells, get them to work together with those motor units, because our goal in all of this is to move our body through space. Make those contractions in our muscles, not just the muscle cell, not just the proteins, not just the fascicle, but in our actual muscles, like the bicep brachia. Now, when I produce tension in a muscle like the bicep brachia, I produce a force, I generate a tension, right? But that tension doesn't always move my body through space. Your muscles, when they're quote unquote relaxed, still have muscle tone. I think we talked about this before in this class. Again, while you're sitting in a chair listening to me talk, if you would reach down and poke your legs, you would say your legs were relaxed and they weren't being contracted. However, if we rolled in somebody who was a paraplegic and you poked their legs, their muscle would feel very, very different in their leg than yours does. because most of our muscles, most of the time, have muscle tone in them, right? Even when I'm not using my right arm, there is muscle tone in these muscles so that my humerus doesn't fall down out of the socket of my joint. We talked about him in our abdominal girdle. We're providing support and protection for those muscles. If instead of sitting in my chair, I was standing up lecturing to you, the reason I wasn't falling over is because I'd be generating muscle tone, helping to support my joints and holding those things together. So even a muscle that is quote unquote relaxed still has some muscle tone in it. However, when we think in terms of contractions, there are actually two types. And one of the important things to remember about our two types of contractions is that when we contract a muscle, again, we are generating tension. And we generate that tension basically to overcome some load, right? This pen has a mass, has a weight to it. It has a load that if I want to lift it up, I have to overcome. And so when we talk about contractions, we are talking about the relationship between the tension or the force that we produce and the load or the work that we have to do, right? Again, as we all know, chemistry is a completely stupid and pointless science, pseudoscience really, but there is a true beauty to physics, and that's what we're talking about here. When we talk about physics, we are talking about generating a force, generating a tension to overcome some load, to do some type of work. Now, the first type of contraction is what we call an isotonic contraction. And it is always important to understand the roots of these words. What does iso mean? Come on, guys. What's iso mean?
Under.
Same. Iso means same, like an isosceles triangle. Means same. Any idea what tonicity or tonic refers to?
Muscle tone?
Yeah, it's the same tone or really tension. So, as the name of this one indicates, this is a contraction where the tension stays the same. Let's think about this. This pen has a mass to it. It has a weight to it. So if I'm going to lift it, I need to produce some force. Now, does this pen weigh more when it is here versus 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 when it is here? Does its weight change or anything like that?
No.
No. So the whole time I'm moving this through space, the amount of force I have to produce stays the same. This pen doesn't get heavier as it moves up in the air or moves down in the air. It doesn't get heavier. So the amount of tension we produce stays the same. Again, Aerobic, if you are correct in that if we were to exit the atmosphere or get very close to the exit of the atmosphere, further away from the surface of the planet, the effects of gravity can decrease. However, for the difference between me standing on the roof of my two-story house and in the basement of my two-story house, when we're talking about those kinds of differences, the effects of gravity are indistinguishable, they're negligible. So when we're talking about moving our body through space, the changes in gravity aren't going to have an effect. All right. So I missed the joke. Yes, Laura.
So I think I'm confused on this one. So isotonic contractions, the tension in the muscle stays the same, but the length of it changes, or is that?
Bingo. And that's exactly what I was getting to as a result of it. So absolutely, the tone or tension, so an isotonic, the tone or tension of the contraction as where, so hold on. Isotonic.
I have a question too when you're ready.
Hold on. So yes, with an isotonic contraction, there are two things. This is a contraction where the tension stays the same and the length of the muscle changes. So yes, that I was just getting to that part of it. So again, I have to generate, and again, 5 units of energy to lift this pen. So as I generate those 5 units of energy, I'm producing them during the whole time. As I'm flexing my arm, the muscle gets shorter and the pen moves through space. But the amount of force I produce during that entire contraction stays the same. Yes, question.
Yeah, I had a question. So isotonic contraction, the load doesn't change on the muscle, but the muscle is changing shape actively versus the other contraction that we're going to get to.
Well, why don't we get to the other one and then you can see how that one works.
Yeah, I was a little confused about this on the simulations. Okay, I'll wait.
Yep. So again, give me an example of an isotonic contraction. You guys are jumping ahead. We'll get to isometric in a second. Let's make sure we understand isotonic first.
Lifting weights?
Or again, perfect example of a basically correct answer, but I always want better examples, right? How about flexing the elbow while you're doing a curl?
Okay.
Right. So let's be precise. When you're flexing the elbow while you're doing a curl, that is an excellent example of an isotonic contraction. All right. The weight, 5 pound, 50 pound, whatever it is that Yulia works out with when she's doing her curls. All right. It stays the same whether it is here or here or here or here or here. So the whole time she's producing the same amount of tension in that muscle. It's isotonic, right? But the muscle is changing shape. It is getting shorter.
So can you think of it as basically every time you flex your muscles? So say you do abs, you're flexing, you do hamstrings, you're also kind of flexing your knee backwards to work your hamstring muscles. And then you, like you said, your biceps, you're also flexing.
Yep. So yes, absolutely. So again, changing the length of the muscle, but producing the same amount of tension. Absolutely.
So what about changing length of muscle, but the force is changing? Kind of like holding a wiggling child. Depending on how much he's jumping, you need to like use more muscles.
Well, but in that case, well, so it depends. If you have that wiggly child and you're trying to hold them away from you, holding them in one position, then notice while you're trying to hold them in one position, you are not changing the shape of your muscles. That would be an example of an isometric contraction. Iso, of course, still means same. Metric in this case means length. So with this type of contraction, right, the length of the muscle does not change. So again, isometric. I want to use the same words. Contraction where the length stays the same. And the force or the load of the force, the tension, can change. Right? Instead of the wiggling kid, although it works the exact same way, let's say I just got home from the store buying groceries. And of course, like I always do, I grab the bag of groceries and I hold them out completely abducted from my body at arm's length with my hand out. This is how I always carry my groceries into the house. Now, as I'm standing there holding a single bag of groceries, my wife comes over and puts 2 more bags of groceries onto my arm. Does my arm go down when she does that?
It can.
Yes. It does.
No, because if it goes down, she wins, right? So what I do instead is I put more force into the muscle to now, instead of hold one bag at arm's length like this, I can now hold 3 bags at arm's length like this, right? I change the amount of force into it, right? And so the length stays the same. There's a whole series of, and at the beginning of the pandemic, this was something that was very, very popular, a bunch of isometric types of exercises, right? What I can do is I can take my 2 hands and I can put them together, and I can push with a lot of force, or I can push with a little force, or I can grab hands and I can pull with a lot of force, or I can pull with a little force, right? I can change the amount of force, but the muscles aren't changing length. It's the same thing if you do these exercises against a wall. You push against a wall, the wall's not going anywhere. So your muscle's not changing length. And whether you push a little bit or you push a lot, the wall doesn't change. Notice we talked about it is a relationship between force and load, tension and load. And notice with an isometric contraction, the load is always equal to the force. Or actually, it should be the other way around. The force is always equal to the load, right? My wife puts 3 more bags onto my arm. I increase the force to match the load. My child takes mercy on me and comes and takes 1 bag off. When she takes 1 bag off of my arm, does my arm suddenly go flying in the air? No, I reduce the amount of force in it to match the load. So for this one, force is always equal to load. Notice for an isotonic contraction, then, it's the exact opposite. For this one, force is never equal to the load. If I'm going to lift that pen and it weighs 1 pound, I need to put 2 pounds of force into my arm to move it through space. Yeah, holding yourself in a planking position would be an example of an isometric contraction. It's a great question. So if depends on the movement, different types of activities, the same way that if you are squatting, you may be flexing some muscles or extending others, or throwing a baseball, some muscles are flexing, some muscles are abducting, things along those lines. So different muscles can be doing different things. But in one muscle, if we were just talking about the bicep brachia, you cannot do an isotonic and an isometric at the same time. You could switch from one to the other, right? When I raise the groceries up, I grab the groceries out of the trunk and I lift them up. That is an isotonic contraction. Then when I hold them there while I walk into the house, that is an isometric contraction. Right? So again, you can switch from one to another, but you can't do both at the same time in the same muscle. Yeah, exactly. Depending on the activity, depending on the movement, you're typically doing one or the other. Exactly. Right. These isometric contractions are also important for maintaining our balance when you're standing upright. You're making small changes in tension in the muscles, right? You're not wobbling side to side. The muscles aren't changing length. You are just changing the tension in them so that they stay the same length so that you don't fall over. Yeah, I think that would be reasonable. Yeah, the abdominals are going to be isometric. Quadriceps and hamstrings are isotonic. That's a good example. Absolutely. All right, so far so good. Again, if this is not making sense, make sure you ask now, because we're going to add one more thing to this that I want to make sure makes sense. All right, excellent. So let's go back to those curls, right? Yulia, do you still have your hand up because you have another question, or did I just forget to put it down after the last one?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
I got it. Okay, so as we were talking about, Yulia's doing those curls with her 50-pound weight so she can get all nice and big and yoked. And I'm sure all of you have been in the gym where you've seen these big, huge, massive guys who do the big curls for the girls, struggle really hard to get that weight up. And then when they get the weight up, they just relax their arms and the weights free fall down to the ground. not to the ground, but pull their arms down. Is that how you're supposed to do a curl? You lift it up and then you just relax the muscles and let it go down? No. You're supposed to control it coming up and control it going down. Now, here's where things get tricky. When I'm doing that flex to bring the weight up, which muscle am I flexing to do that?
Your bicep.
Bicep brachii. When I'm extending my elbow, bringing the weight down, which muscle am I using for that?
Your tricep.
Are you really? Try it. Grab a pen and lower it. And as you lower it, feel your arms. Where is the tension actually located?
I would say the short head, maybe.
It's the bicep. Notice it's still the bicep. The bicep controls it both coming up for the flex and it controls it going down as well. The reason for that, Daniel was saying, is you want to train that opposite for it as well, is because there are actually two different types of isotonic contractions. Remember, isotonic contractions is where the tension in the muscle.
Sorry.
No problem. Thought you were talking to me. I was going to stop talking. I was going to be good. Tension in the muscle stays the same. And the length changes. And remember here, the tension is never equal to the load. But notice we keep saying changing length. We keep saying changing length. We don't keep saying shorten because there are actually two types of isotonic contractions. When I'm lifting that pen up, when I'm doing that curl, in that case, the tension that I'm producing is greater than the load. When I do that, the muscle is going to shorten, and we call that a concentric contraction. So this pen weighs 1 pound. I put 2 pounds of force into my arm, and the muscle shortens. I bring the weight up in a concentric contraction. However, when I want to take that pen down, that 1 pound pen down, instead of if I made 1 pound in my arm, then it would just hold it in place. So instead, what I put is just 1/2 pound of tension into my arm. And as I put 1/2 pound of tension into my arm, that weight is going to bring my arm down, right? If you stood there with your arms out and I came and put my wife's mini into your hands, how many of you would be able to hold it up?
Nobody.
Probably not too many of you. And so what would happen is even though you were putting force into it, the weight was heavier than your arms and it would draw your arms down. It would extend the muscle. And that's all I'm doing here. I put 1/2 pound of tension into my muscle, and my 1 pound pen in a controlled fashion brings it down. And that is what we call an eccentric contraction. With an eccentric contraction, the tension that we produce is less than the load. And when the tension is less than the load, the muscle lengthens during the contraction. So when you're doing that bicep curl the proper way, controlling it up and controlling it down, you are doing both a concentric and an eccentric contraction of the muscles. Or let's put them all together. Laura, I see your hand, but let's put them all together. Me with my groceries. I grab the bags. I use a concentric contraction to bring them up. I then use an isometric contraction to hold my arm in place to bring them into the house. And then when I get to the kitchen table of the house, do I just relax my arm and let those eggs flop to the table? No, I make an eccentric contraction where I control it down and set it calmly on the table. Laura, what was your question?
Yes. So before the break, we kind of went over how the sarcomeres didn't attach, or like the myosin heads, and that they weren't fully covered by the sarcomere. Is this have to do with that, or?
It doesn't, but I'm so glad you asked that question, because you're right. That is the problem with this. We've learned about the contractile cycle. We know how the myosin head grabs and does its power stroke and pulls towards the M line, and the sarcomer gets shorter. So how can we have an eccentric contraction where everything's pulling towards the inside, but the muscle still gets longer? You're absolutely right. That doesn't make sense. But here's the example I would give you. Again, 23 of us now in here, me versus 22 of you playing tug of war. Who is going to win?
Us.
Absolutely you guys, right? Notice I will be taking my muscle contraction cycles. I'm going to reach, I'm going to grab, I'm going to pull, I'm going to let go, right? That's what my contractile cycle is. I'm grabbing and pulling, trying to pull you guys towards me. But you guys have so much more strength and so much more force that as I'm grabbing and pulling, you're going to be jerking the rope away from me, and you're going to be jerking my arm back out, or the rope is going to be sliding in my hands, as even though I'm grabbing and pulling, you guys are pulling it away from me. So notice it's a very jerky action. As a result of that, these eccentric contractions are much more impactful on the muscles. Right? We just had a spring break. So I'm sure, like me, you guys ran to New York for the week, right? We all went. If you're losing tug of war, that would be an example of how the muscle cell would lengthen while you're still putting force into it. Even though you're still trying to use force to pull on that rope, the rope is still getting pulled away from you. So that would kind of be what's happening in the sarcomere with the myosin and the actin. Absolutely. So go to New York for spring break, take the tour of the Statue of Liberty. And when you go to the Statue of Liberty, everybody always wants to go up to the top. The problem is there's no elevator. So it's nothing but stairs. You've got to walk up 762 stairs or whatever the heck it is. I don't know what the number is. And then you have to walk down 762 stairs. Right? So after walking up and down 2,000 stairs, how do you feel the next day in your quadriceps? Sore, absolutely. And the reason you feel sore is actually more the coming down the stairs than it was going up the stairs. If you think about how your leg works when you're going down the stairs, notice when you're going down the stairs as the leg is going down, you are elongating your quadricep. So as you're going down the stairs, your quadricep is elongating. Walking down hills, walking downstairs is an eccentric contraction in the quadricep, and it is much more impactful. And so when your quadriceps are sore from something like that, it's actually from walking down. Going up, you are making eccentric contractions of your hamstring muscles. And so again, both your hamstrings and your quadriceps hurt the next day. The hamstrings are sore from going up. The quadriceps are sore from coming down. I'm not sure what you mean by passive force.
So PhysioX activity was talking about how we get active force from the muscle and passive happens only when the muscles are stretched.
Right. So remember, we talked about how muscles have elasticity. They want to go back to their normal resting position. So if you stretch a muscle out, it wants to go back to its resting position. And remember, we talked about how that is a passive property. It's not using energy. It's using the elasticity of the connective tissue and that titin to want to bring it back. So yes, that's what they were talking about.
Does it in any way help us with what we're doing, the activity? Does it provide any?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay.
All right. Excellent. So notice really three types of contractions: isometric, a concentric isotonic, and an eccentric isotonic. And notice the difference between all three of them is the relationship of tension and the work that has to be done. If the tension and the force are the same, then it's going to be an isometric contraction. If the tension is greater than the load, our muscle gets shorter and it's a concentric contraction. And if the tension is less than the load, the muscle is going to get longer and it's an eccentric contraction. And of course, if the load and the tension are the same, the muscle doesn't change length. Isometric. All right. So this is how we move our body through space. This is how we maintain our balance. This is how we stand upright. It's by this relationship between the force that we're generating and the loads we have to overcome. And we'll absolutely get to that soreness and why it's there in just a bit. Excellent. In fact, that's what we're going to do next. However, before we get to it, this is a good stopping point. So this is a good natural break. We now know how to contract a muscle. So what we have to worry about next is how to get the energy to contract a muscle. So let's go ahead and take our first break here. It looks like it's 12:55. It's a teeny bit early, but this is a good natural stopping point. So let's go ahead and take our break here. So let's come back at 1:10. And we will restart at 1:10. And I'll start the recording at that point as well. All right, any questions? All right, see you guys in 15 minutes. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I saw there was a question during the break. No, we still have new material that we're covering both today and also on Thursday. Both lecture and lab. We've got a lot of muscle still left to go. So a ton of lab stuff. But a little more lecture today, and then also a little lecture on Thursday. And don't forget, since basically the first lecture, we have been talking solely about skeletal muscle. Remember, as we talked about, one of the things we'll be talking about on Thursday is taking all the information we've learned about skeletal muscle and using that to relate, albeit briefly, to differences in cardiac muscle and smooth muscle and how they work as well. But we're not quite done with skeletal muscle yet, so let's move on to that. We now know how to contract a muscle. We know the different types of muscles, but what we also know is what are the two resources that are needed and required for a muscle to contract?
ATP and calcium?
Absolutely. ATP and calcium. And if you think about it, is calcium used up in that process? Broken down or anything like that? No, right? We hide it away or we release it, but it's not actually used up. However, as we know, ATP is split. It is, so whereas calcium is a reusable resource, our ATP isn't. And so if we're going to contract a muscle, we are going to need to have sources of ATP. So when I have a muscle like my arm that's been sitting here for 5 minutes in a relaxed state, and suddenly I decide to contract it, where is it getting the ATP to do that contraction? What do you guys think?
The mitochondria?
Well, true. Ultimately, it comes from the mitochondria, but when a muscle is relaxed, is it right? It's got some ATP already in it, right? Because it's been producing it, using it for other things, and along those lines, it's stored up. So it has stored ATP already in the muscle cell. If the muscle cell isn't contracting, it's not actively using ATP. And so there's just some readily available stored ATP just floating around in the cytosol. The same way that there are amino acids floating around and glycogen and all of these things located in here. This is just stored, readily available ATP. Right? However, the ATP that's in a muscle cell would only sustain a contraction for about 2 to 10 seconds. Is that all I can contract a muscle for? I can only contract a muscle for 10 seconds and then it completely fails on me?
No.
No.
No. So this, again, this is readily available. ATP in the cytosol, but it's very limited. Luckily, we have other means of getting ATP as well. The first of those is an energy molecule known as creatine phosphate. Oops. Creatine phosphate is a more stable, let's even say that, energy molecule than ATP. Yes, myosin heads use ATP, but our calcium pumps use ATP. All sorts of other things in a cell use ATP as well. So what happens is we have, and actually let's do this on the whiteboard. We have a protein called creatine. And when the muscle is at rest, there is lots of ATP available. All right, because again, the muscle is not being used. So during rest, what ends up happening is creatine actually goes to an ATP and it rips off one of its phosphates. It'll split the ATP. When it splits the ATP, it forms a molecule called creatine phosphate. And of course, when you rip one of the phosphates off of ATP, what do you have as a result of that?
ADP.
ADP.
ADP. Absolutely ADP. And as you guys mentioned, that ADP could go to a mitochondria and get a new phosphate, or is floating around or doing whatever. So while we are at rest, notice this chemical reaction is going in this direction. But it turns out this reaction is reversible. So when a muscle is contracting, when a muscle contracts, there is much less ATP in the cell, and there's now more ADP. And when that occurs, so when contracted, what ends up happening is our creatine phosphate gives, oops, if I spell it right, gives a phosphate to the ADP. Notice like the myosin head rips off that phosphate and uses the energy. The creatine doesn't use the energy, it just stores the energy. And so what it's able to do is give it back. Of course, it then becomes creatine again. But what it has done is it has reformed a new ATP. All right, so when this occurs, notice it's going this chemical reaction basically in the opposite direction. So at rest, it is storing, creatine phosphate stores the energy and then can give the energy back to the ATP when the muscle contracts. I always think of this as terms of money. Right? At any one time, you have X amount of dollars in your wallet, right? I go downstairs, grab my wallet, and because, you know, I'm a fully tenured college professor, I'm sure I have somewhere around $400, $500 cash in my wallet. You know, chump change, just running around town change, right? But you know how it is. Once you have a $100 bill in your pocket, it's spent like that, right? It's easily gone. So what I can do instead is take that money and put it in the bank. If I put it in the checking account, I still have that ATM card that allows me to quickly access it so I can pay for my groceries and things along those ways. But if it's in the bank, it's not in my pocket, and I'm less likely to spend it on frivolous things. That's kind of what we have here. Creatine phosphate is the energy bank. It takes that energy and stores it. So when our muscle is contracting, we can readily give it back to it. Notice the key to this. We are not making new ATP. We're not making new energy, right? We are just changing the form of it. Right? If I got $100 on my birthday and I decide to keep 10 of those dollars in my pocket and put 90 of it in the bank, or whether I keep 50 in my pocket and put 50 in the bank, right? It still adds up to just $100. All I have is $100. Some of it's more stable, some of it's more readily available, but I'm not making new energy. All right? This is useful for, again, having that stable stored energy, allowing us to be able to make those muscle contractions. Yep, I'll talk about that in just a second. Let me finish this and then I will answer that question. Because it's a more stable energy molecule, we often can have as much as 3 times as much creatine phosphate in our muscle cells than we do ATP. And so, yes, those people that take creatine as a muscle building supplement, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get more creatine into their muscle cells so their muscle cells can store more energy so they can produce force for a longer period of time, work out harder, work out stronger, right? Get more energy for that. Absolutely. Laura, did you have a question as well?
Yes. So does the creatine phosphate aid in helping reach the maximum tension of the muscle?
No, not so much about reaching maximal tension, but what it does allow, again, if you think about it, every power stroke of a myosin head requires the energy from an ATP. So the more ATP that's available, the stronger or the longer we can contract that muscle. So this is, it's, you know, you have to have gas to be able to, you know, drive your car. It doesn't necessarily make you drive faster, but obviously the more gas you have, the faster and the longer you can drive. This would, to answer your question, this would typically cause less lactic acid. And again, we'll see how that works in just a minute. So we will talk about that, Madison, yet. But hopefully the goal is with this, again, you're not getting as much lactic acid buildup. Ariana, you had a question.
So just to understand creatine phosphate, it basically, you said it stores energy, and then at rest, creatine plus ATP creates more creatine phosphate and ADP, and then when it contracts, it uses less ATP to create more ADP.
So yeah, so notice here, we have the equation right here.
Mm-hmm.
Creatine plus ATP equals creatine phosphate plus ADP. But it is a reversible reaction. So with reversible reactions, basically what determines which way it goes is how much of the resources are there. If there is more ATP, which is typically like what happens when the cell is at rest. So if the cell is at rest and there's more ATP, then the chemical reaction is more likely to go this way. The creatine molecules will rip a phosphate off of the ATP and store it. However, when we exercise, when we contract that muscle, then the amount of ATP goes down, the amount of ADP goes up. And when that occurs, then this reaction is going to go in the opposite direction. And our creatine phosphates will give its phosphate to an ADP to make more ATP to keep the contraction going.
Oh, okay. It makes sense now. Thank you.
Yeah. Because it's a reversible reaction, basically how much of these resources are available is going to determine the direction that it goes. All right, excellent. And again, because there's more of this, because it's a more stable energy molecule, it's storing energy, but our pumps don't use it and things along those lines. So it's easier for the muscle to keep around. We are able to, again, replenish the ATP. We're not making new. That's one of the keys. We're not making new ATP. We are just replenishing the ATP that is there, and we could produce a contraction that could last as long as 20 seconds. But again, is that all I can hold my contraction for, 20 seconds, and then I'm done? No. Right? It's like I talked about. I have that $100 that I got for my birthday. I put some of it in the bank. I kept some of it in my pocket, but eventually I'm going to use it all up. And once I use up that 100, I have no choice but to come here and lecture to you. Because by coming here and lecturing to you, they give me more money. And so once we've used up what's readily available, we have to make more. And there are, and you guys have already kind of mentioned them, 2 ways we can make new ATP. The first of that is aerobic respiration. Again, aerobic respiration is also what we call cellular respiration. We talked about this way, way back in the day. We take a sugar like glucose, and we want to break it down completely. And what do we need to completely break down that sugar?
Oxygen.
Oxygen, absolutely. We need oxygen. And with that oxygen, we can completely break down that sugar and we get energy. And we use that energy to make ATP. But there are also 2 waste products. What are the 2 waste products of this process?
CO2 and H2O.
Yeah, exactly. Carbon dioxide and water. Oops. Excellent. So with oxygen, we are able to completely break down a sugar molecule, getting a massive amount of energy that we can use to make ATP. And there's 2 waste products, carbon dioxide and water. Right? Cellular respiration. It's the whole reason we do this. Right? We breathe in to get the oxygen that our cells need. We breathe out the CO2 that the cells are producing as waste. That is what cellular respiration. And remind me again, even though it's in the picture, and so hopefully it should be easy, where does this occur?
Mitochondria.
Yeah. This occurs at the mitochondria. Right? This is an incredibly efficient process. In this, a single glucose can produce somewhere between 34 and 36 ATP. Oops, if I spelled glucose right. So a single glucose can be used to produce as much as 34 to 36 ATP. It is an incredibly efficient process, right? Is there a downside to this process?
Doesn't it take a while? Or
Doesn't it require oxygen to produce
Yeah.
that much?
You guys
Yeah.
have them both on the head. Obviously, the first and most obvious is that it requires oxygen. But you are also correct. This is a relatively slow process. Right? So, in this way, we can produce massive amounts of ATP, right? How long can you stand for?
it depends on which way you're standing.
I just mean,
I guess a while.
yeah, pretty much ever, pretty much forever, right? And if you think about it, everything is walking distance if you have the time, right? How long can you walk for? Hours, right? So with this process, we can produce massive amounts of ATP to maintain Oops. Moderate activities for hours. Hours worth of ATP. I can stand at my job taking money at a toll booth for 8 hours. I can walk around the restaurant waiting tables for my 7.5-hour shift. I can walk from here to Napa, California if I wanted to. All right, might take me a few days, but I could get there. Is an incredibly efficient way of producing ATP. However, if instead of walking from here to Napa, California, I decided to sprint from here to Napa, California, would I make it all the way?
I don't know. Depends on your body.
Yeah, I guess. Depends on where I'm starting, right? If I'm in Yountville, maybe I might be able to get it. But starting up here in Roseville, I'm not going to make it sprinting all the way to Napa, California, right? Absolutely. I would likely die as well. So while this is sufficient for moderate activity, it can only produce about 1/3 of the energy needed for a maximal intensity contraction. So I can sprint, right? I could sprint for a very, very short period of time. Right? All right, excellent. So again, we have this here. Requires oxygen, fully break down fatty acids and glucose, forms a lot of ATP, energy for hours of moderate activity. Yep, slow and steady wins the race. But again, it can't provide enough energy for a maximal intensity contraction. Does that mean it is not possible to contract a muscle at its maximal intensity? Is it possible to sprint?
It's possible.
Well, can you sprint?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, not for hours.
Just
but
for a
you can
short
sprint.
amount of time.
Absolutely. For a short amount of time, because we have a second way to make ATP. And that second way to make ATP is anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is basically glycolysis. Glycolysis is basically the splitting of a glucose molecule. This is actually the first step in aerobic respiration as well. What happens is we take one glucose and we split it. And from that, we get energy for 2 ATP, and we get 2 molecules called pyruvic acid, or 2 pyruvates, also known as pyruvic acids. Then, with oxygen, the pyruvates enter the mitochondria and are completely breaking down. But without oxygen, cannot enter the mitochondria. So notice in this case, without oxygen, we go from getting 32 to 36 ATP to 1 glucose, giving us just 2 ATP. All right? Not nearly as energy efficient. You just went from your hybrid that was getting 35 miles to a gallon to that Hummer, which is getting 2 miles per gallon. Obviously, one of the big problems with this is you are going to use up your fuel very quickly. we're going to use up all of our glucose very, very rapidly as a result of that. And that's definitely a bad thing. However, the worst thing about this is that those pyruvates if they do not enter the mitochondria, I'm just going to abbreviate it to mito like that. They are instead converted into lactic acid. And lactic acid is a toxic waste product that damages the cell and leads to fatigue. Right. So once you start building up that lactic acid, that is when you are no longer able to sprint anymore.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
So my husband played soccer for a really long time, and he said sometimes before games, especially if they did like the far like away games, like 3-4 hours away, they all sat in a bus and they would get to a stop, and a lot of them would just pick up like gummy bears or like something just really fast and sugary and dissolvable, obviously avoiding chocolate because it's a dairy product. And he just said it was like something to make like a fast energy for your metabolism before you go to a game instead of drinking like an energy drink. How would that really correlate with, would this be kind of like the same situation of making a fast sugar for your body to use the energy?
So again, remember, whether you're making ATP aerobically or anaerobically, we need the fuel of the glucose to start. So when you are eating a huge handful of gummy bears, that spikes the glucose levels in your blood, which causes your insulin to be produced from your pancreas. And insulin basically tells your cells, especially your liver and especially your muscle cells, to take that glucose and store it inside of the muscle cells. So it basically crams all that glucose into the muscle cells to get it out of the blood. Right? So it would be, I guess in a very short term, it would be a way to get some extra glucose, you know, filling up the tank before your muscle starts to get that fuel in there. The problem with that would be timing, because the problem with that is insulin is a longer lasting hormone. So what typically happens, you know, like with little kids, you see it sometimes, they eat all that sugar, they have the cake, they have that at the birthday party, they produce a huge spike of glucose in their blood.
That was my daughter on Easter.
Huge spike of insulin, and then that insulin stays in their blood for a longer period of time. So not only does sugar come back to the normal level, but sugar level in the blood then drops, and you typically have that crash afterwards. So yeah, so you have to be careful about that, because you do run the risk of, if you're getting too much sugar into your system, that you're going to get that crash as a result of the insulin.
Well, like they would typically like eat like the gummy bears or like quick sugars pretty much about 20 minutes before they started warm-ups, and then ran for 90 minutes. You know what I mean? So I wonder.
It's not any different from endurance athletes who, you know, like runners or will have like goos and things like that they eat along the way to try to maintain elevated levels of glucose in their blood, so that can be provided for their muscles as they're exercising. So it's not any different than that. Yep.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yep. All right. So there you go. Again, we have this process of glycolysis, where glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid, but then converted into lactic acid, right? It's a quick and dirty way of making ATP, but it is not efficient. And it forms that lactic acid that can ultimately lead to fatigue. All right, so notice there are 4 ways that we can provide the energy necessary for a maximal intensity contraction. If you needed to contract a muscle at its maximal intensity, these are the things you're going to use. First, the readily available fuel, the ATP and the creatine phosphate. You'll be able to make some ATP aerobically, but if you're doing a maximal intensity contraction, you're also going to need to use anaerobic respiration, that glycolysis, which, among other things, builds up lactic acid. And that lactic acid is one of the major factors that lead to muscle fatigue. All right. What does it mean for a muscle to be fatigued?
Is it not
weak.
responding to stimuli, even though the intensity didn't decrease?
So that's not a bad way of thinking of it, but again, we want to be more precise. One of the keys that I think sometimes people are confused of is this is not muscle failure, right? We're not talking about the muscle failing. My favorite example to use from this, and it's happening right now as we speak, right? America's pastime, baseball, is going on as we speak, right? Giants, I'm sure, are doing horrible like they usually do. You know, one of the amazing things about baseball is more and more pitchers each year are able to throw the ball 100 miles an hour, right? 4 years ago, there were 2 pitchers in the league that could throw the ball 100 miles an hour. Now it seems like every team has 2 pitchers who can throw the ball 100 miles an hour or faster. Throwing the ball 100 miles an hour is incredibly impressive. But what happens is you get these starting pitchers who start out throwing the ball 100 miles an hour, and by the 5th inning, they're throwing the ball 95 miles an hour. Now, throwing a ball 95 miles an hour is still impressive, but is that muscle performing at the level it was before?
No.
No. So that muscle is fatigued. Right? Notice they're still able to use the muscle. They're still throwing the ball 95 miles an hour. That's still hella impressive. But technically, they are fatigued. So muscle fatigue is not muscle failure. Muscle fatigue is when the muscle cannot perform at the required level of activity. Muscle failure can occur. It is much more rare, but it happened, I guess, 5 years ago now. If you guys remember 5 years ago during the Summer Olympics, there was a female marathoner who ran the whole 26.15 miles of that, got to the track, to the finish line, could see the finish line from where she was, and she collapsed. Her muscles failed and they had to bring out an ambulance. And even though she could see the finish line from where she was not capable of completing the marathon, right? They had to wheel her away from there, right? That can happen, but it rarely happens. No, what we're talking about when we talk about muscle fatigue, we mean that muscle is not able to perform at the required level of activity. That's what muscle fatigue is. Now, the full mechanism for muscle fatigue is not completely understood, but we do know many of the factors that influence it. So let's talk about this. When we talk about muscle fatigue, what do you guys think what some of the possible factors that could cause muscle fatigue might be?
The use of muscles.
Okay, but what about the use of the muscles? Obviously, yes, it comes from muscle use. Yep.
I would say the tension, like the weight. Say like if you're squatting, 5 sets of 135 pounds, you're gonna get fatigued. Like
Why?
you're not gonna be able to go all the way down.
Why? You're right, but why? What is it about that?
I literally just did this in the PhysioX. It's because it has to do with I want to say it's the stimulus of the weight that you're putting onto your body that you're working this out loud in my head. Can somebody help me out here? Does someone know what I'm trying to say?
I think sometimes the delay between that communication
Yes.
makes it lagging in action.
Yeah, like the more weight you use, the longer your latent period of using those muscles becomes. And so that's going to cause the longer fatigue. So like the more weight you're putting on those muscles, it's going to cause it to just kind of hit a plateau where you no longer can lift that weight as much as you used to, or for as many times as you want.
You guys have the right idea. With more continuous use, you're going to fatigue more quickly. But what I'm looking for is more precise reason why. One of them, as someone's mentioned here, is buildup of waste products. And more specifically, which waste product in particular?
Lactic acid?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest ones is lactic acid. As I mentioned, lactic acid is a toxin, so it damages the cell, right? But also, as the name indicates, it's an acid. And an acid obviously changes the pH. Why would changing the pH of the cell be an issue?
Denatured proteins.
Right, absolutely. The muscle cell is filled with proteins. And proteins are sensitive. Yes, in extreme cases, it could denature them, but it doesn't even have to go that far. Remember, one of the proteins we said that was highly sensitive to pH changes was troponin. When the pH changes in the troponin changes its shape slightly. And now it's just a little harder for the calcium to bind to it. So if the calcium can't bind to it, it can't move the regulatory proteins. Fewer myosin heads grab and pull. And as fewer myosin heads grab and pull, our muscle performs weaker than it did before. So absolutely, that can be a big issue. Absolutely. Loss of resources. Those loss of resources, for instance, like ATP, we run out of ATP. Of course, we need glucose to make that ATP. I don't know why I keep doing that one backwards. To make the ATP, so we run out of those. And also, you know, lipids can be used for that as well. But when we run out of those fuels, we run out of the ATP to be able to do that. I think I saw someone else come up with ionic imbalances. Absolutely, right? Changes in calcium levels, sodium levels, potassium levels, manganese, all of these ionic imbalances are things that can have an effect changing the function of the cell. pH can denature the proteins, absolutely. But again, especially like Madison was talking about before, when you're using really heavy weights, right? One of the things that you guys have talked about is how you're sore the next day, because you actually are going to, while that myosin head is grabbing and pulling and producing that force, you are going to damage and misalign our proteins, right? Our sarcomeres, the myosin heads can rip off. Actin can bend and break, right? All of these things are things that can be damaged or misaligned from the act of moving the muscles, causing that damage at a cellular region. So we got damage and misalignment of the proteins, ionic imbalances, a loss of resources, and that pesky lactic acid that builds up as well. All of these are major factors that directly impact the ability of the muscle to be able to do work. But lactic acid has another really interesting effect. Being a toxin, being an acid, it isn't something the cell wants to keep inside of it. So our muscle cells, as it builds up lactic acid, will release it into the blood. And when they release that lactic acid into the blood, the goal is to get it to the kidney for release from the body, or the liver, because the liver can transform it, break it down. Let's say to break it down. We'll start with that. So it releases it into the blood. And something really interesting happens when lactic acid gets into the blood. I think we talked about this in this class already, but I'll bring it up again. I'll ask again, is anybody here an endurance athlete, like especially a runner? Or know somebody who is?
I
Used
know
to.
someone who
Okay.
used to be.
So for those people who like to run marathons, those very interesting, odd individuals, my wife happens to be one of them, like to run those marathons. Typically when they're training for that marathon, do they ever run those 26.2 miles before the day of the race?
No.
No, right? In fact, typically all of their practice runs stay under 20 miles. The reason for that is something really weird happens when you hit that 20-mile mark when a person is running, right? They hit that wall where they know with 100% certainty that if they take one more step, they are going to die. Of course, being the slightly twisted individuals they are, they take one more step. And do they actually die?
No.
No. And they take another step, even though they feel they're going to die, and another step, even though they feel they're going to die. And after a few more of those, they realize they're not going to die, and they break through that wall, often leading to that condition that they refer to as a runner's high from breaking through that wall. What that sense telling your body that you are going to die if you take one more step, that if you take one more, if you're sprinting and you have to stop because otherwise you're going to die, what we actually call that is systemic fatigue. Systemic fatigue is actually a cognitive effect. It's your brain lying to you. Basically, when there's lactic acid in the blood, your brain receives that information. And when your brain senses it, it goes, oh, they're using their muscles really, really hard right now, and they could get hurt. They need to stop. And so your brain tells you that if you take one more step, you're going to die. Right? We know this is a cognitive effect because let's go back to me holding up those books for my principal. I had to hold those books up and I could hold them up for about 3 minutes before I finally had to drop them and I got swatted by the principal. However, if I had to hold those books up and if I couldn't hold them up, instead of getting swatted, I was going to get shot in the head. Would I be able to hold those books up for longer than 3 minutes?
Yep.
Yeah. If I told you to go sprint outside for as far as you could sprint, and if you sprint as far as you can sprint, I will give you 2 points of extra credit.
That's not enough extra credit.
Right. Or if instead a bear with an axe was standing behind you and you needed to sprint to get away from the bear with an axe, under which of those two conditions would you be able to go for longer?
Honestly, probably the extra credit right now.
I know, I was going to say extra credit.
All right, come on. 2 points of extra credit's not going to do anything to anybody in this class, right? Absolutely. But I appreciate the sentiment, but you get the point, right? Obviously, our motivation has a huge effect on how long we are able to do this for. Right. So, yeah, exactly. There are all these fun things, right? So, exactly. So, obviously, this cognitive effect, right, is a protective, right? It's a cognitive effect. It's a protective measure from our nervous system to protect our muscles so that we don't get injured. All right.
I have a question. So, because I used to compete in cheerleading, I know it sounds crazy, but we would have to do excessive amounts of like stunting, running, jumping, tumbling, and dance in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And now I'm kind of seeing like my body would definitely hit this point where it'd be like that 2 minute mark of the 2 minute and 30 second routine. And I would literally just black out. Like I wouldn't even know what I did the last 30 seconds. So like, this is like, okay, like this is a pretty good example of what I did at one point or another.
Absolutely. Yeah. Getting past that systemic fatigue again, because you were motivated to do so. Right.
No, I just wanted to go home. Yeah. So.
Right. So yeah, exactly. So obviously our motivation, right, affects that systemic fatigue. And so whether it's because you want to reach the finish line, whether you want to complete that routine, whether you're running from the bear with an axe, right, it's going to be able to push yourself to go further beyond what you would if you were just doing it for fun. Right, because this lactic acid in our blood gives us this very strong cognitive protective reflex that say you need to stop contracting that muscle so that you don't hurt yourself.
Yeah.
All right.
Never stopped me, but okay.
Well, and again, the same thing with those marathoners. They push beyond. And so that's typically why you don't run a marathon every day, right? We have these. Now, again, once a muscle fatigues, is it fatigued forever? Once that pitcher's, in the fifth inning can't throw 100 miles an hour anymore, is he never able to throw 100 miles an hour again?
No, just temporarily.
Yeah, temporarily. Muscle fatigue can be recovered from. Now, how long does that muscle fatigue last? That's the other big question. You were talking about that high intensity activity that lasted a couple minutes, like, for instance, the cheerleader routine, or like, for instance, that sprint, or swimmers are another great example, where they have to do that rapid, fast movement for a very short, intense period of time, and they're absolutely fatigued after that. But Madison, how long were you fatigued after that cheerleading routine? Right? If you did that 2.5-minute routine at the beginning of the game, were you able to do it again at halftime or do it again after the game?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Apparently she passed out on us, but it's okay, right? Or take again, Olympics are right around the corner. With the track and field, with a sprinter, how many races do they typically run during the course of the day? With the swimmers, how many races do they do? They've got the qualifying trials, they've got the quarterfinals, all of that. They can do 5, 6, 7 races during the course of the day. How many marathons do the marathoners run during the course of a day at the Olympics?
1.
Yeah, how many do they run for the entire Olympics?
1.
1. So notice, while sprinting is an incredibly intense, impactful type of activity, it is much easier to recover from that short-term intense activity like the sprint, whereas that marathon activity requires much, much more recovery from. It fatigues the muscle. It's much more impactful on the muscle. It kind of goes back to what you guys were talking about before with working out, right? You see lots of people in the exam, now I want to say lab. I've got it all in the gym, doing fast, impactful, the jerking up of that big, huge, massive amount of weight. And then, like we said, they just relax and let it fall, and that big, huge, jerking amount of weight. And that is one way to do things. But as we talked about, if you are slower and more controlled in the activity, both up and down, it is going to be a much more impactful and therefore much more successful activity for building strength and building endurance that way. Now, we've fatigued the muscle. What we need to do is now recover from that activity. Recovery, of course, reestablishes those normal conditions. And this is basically accomplished by one of two things. The first thing we have to do is get rid of that lactic acid. Lactic acid is, again, toxic. So we can do this by releasing the lactic acid into the blood. And as we said, once it is in the blood, basically it's going to go one of two places. It's either going to go to the kidneys and it's expelled from the body. But we also talked about how the liver and the muscle cells can actually recycle the lactic acid. The way they do this is they can actually convert the lactic acid back into pyruvic acid. However, to do this requires oxygen. Of course, once we have those pyruvates, the pyruvates can then enter the mitochondria to make ATP. But what does that need for those pyruvates to be able to enter into the mitochondria?
ADP?
Well, to make the, yes, obviously we need ADP to convert it into ATP. But remember, the pyruvates got converted into lactic acid because we were missing something. Something's needed for those pyruvates to enter the mitochondria. What was that again?
Oxygen?
Yeah. Requires oxygen, right? With this way, we can make lots of ATP. Oops, wow, that's weird. With that pyruvate, with that, and that ATP can be used for pumps to reestablish our ion concentrations. Right? We can use ATP to make new proteins and repair damaged proteins. We need to make more or store more, let's say it that way, glucose to make more glycogen. Remember also, we talked about how our muscle cells, let's do this one down here, have that special protein, myoglobin. What was myoglobin again? What did it do?
Doesn't it hold
Store of
oxygen?
oxygen?
Yeah, right. Remember myoglobin. Ugh. Right, so we need to be able to replace the oxygen in the myoglobin. Obviously, that requires oxygen. Right, so we need to replace the myoglobin. We need to make new proteins. We need to store new glucose. And notice all of these things require oxygen. We need oxygen to make ATP, oxygen to replace this, oxygen to convert this. So notice what's actually happened here. When we use a muscle, we incur an oxygen debt. And we need to pay back that oxygen debt. You haven't thought of it in those terms, but you are absolutely positively aware of this. Because as you're all sitting here calmly listening to me lecture, your breathing is normal. If we all had to get up and start running around the room, and we ran around the room 16 times, would your breathing rate stay the same as it is right now?
No.
Oh.
No, breathing rate would come up. And once you sat back down in your chair after going around the room 16 times, the second you sat down in the chair, does your breathing go back instantly to where it was before? You're not running anymore, so does your breathing go back to normal immediately?
No.
No.
It takes time.
No, your
No.
breathing stays elevated for a period of time after exercise. And why does it stay elevated for after exercise? Because we need to pay back that oxygen debt. We need to use oxygen to make ATP, to get rid of the lactic acid, to replace the oxygen in the myoglobin. We need to do all these things to pay that oxygen debt. And guess what? Our muscles are not the only organs that incurs when you work out vigorously, when you run that race. What are some of the other organs or organ systems that occur an oxygen debt?
Brain?
Yeah, nervous system, absolutely. We're firing all those action potentials. They're going to need to reestablish their ion concentrations. They released all of that acetylcholine. They're going to need to replace their neurotransmitter. So absolutely, our nervous system is one of them. What else does?
Kidney.
Kidney's a good guess, but actually our kidneys are actually more active, processing more blood when you're at rest than you are when you're exercising. So it's a good thought, but no, the kidneys aren't one of them. But you're along the right path. What other organs or organ systems are more active when you're exercising?
Wouldn't the
Cardiac.
Heart.
cardiovascular?
Heart, cardiac muscle, absolutely. Your heart's going to be more. What else? What were you saying, Julia?
I said the same thing, cardiovascular
Yeah,
system.
heart, absolutely. What else works more when you're exercising?
Our stomach.
Well, your digestive functions actually decrease when you're exercising, right? You don't want to eat that big, huge cheeseburger and then immediately start working out, because then blood goes to other parts of your body instead of to your stomach, and so it doesn't break it down. Endocrine, sure, some of them absolutely, like your adrenal glands are going to be releasing more materials. That's a good one. That's not bad. I got two that I can think of we haven't hit yet. There you go. Our sweat glands. Of course, now that we're sophisticated 430 students, we can be more precise than sweat glands. Which specific
Sebaceous?
glands were?
It's subcutaneous.
All right, so sudoriferous was the general type, in which sebaceous, remember the oil glands. The sweat glands were the sudoriferous glands, but which specific sudoriferous gland produces the watery sweat that helps us to regulate body temperature?
Is it apical?
Was it apocrine?
No, it wasn't apocrine, it was the other one.
Sorry.
Endocrine.
It was the E one. It was the E one. There we go. Oh,
Endocrine.
closer. Eccrine.
Eccentric.
Eccrine sweat glands.
We're all playing the
There
guessing
we
game
go.
right now.
Well, I will remind you, there is a cumulative final exam in this class. You do actually have to remember the stuff that we've talked about from the beginning. So again, let's not forget that. There you go. Eccrine sweat glands, absolutely. And then, right, our respiratory system, our breathing muscles, right, the muscles associated with breathing, all of those are examples of things that also, outside of just the muscles that we're exercising, are going to incur this oxygen debt. Right, so again, I've done it here on the board, but here we got all the pretty pictures here. Right, we have to make more ATP to put it back into creatine phosphate, get rid of that lactic acid, right? Repair, all of those things are all ways that we need to pay back that oxygen debt. So our respiration stays elevated after exercise so that we can pay back the oxygen debt, not just in the muscles, but also in other organs as well. However, there is one point I want to make. This oxygen debt is at the cellular level. If you were to actually monitor somebody's oxygen carrying capacity before exercise, during exercise, and after exercise, the oxygen carrying capacity of their blood is the same. Right? So the oxygen debt is at the cellular level. I find this incredibly amusing because, again, football's right around the corner. And it happens more, I think, when the defensive guys are more active than when the offensive guys. You see that defensive back make the interception, run it all the way back for a touchdown. And when he gets to the sidelines, he does two things. The first thing he does is wave to the camera and say, "Hi, Mom." And the second thing he gets is he grabs that oxygen mask and holds that oxygen mask over his face because he's so exhausted he needs the oxygen. That oxygen mask isn't doing anything. It's not dramatically, all that vigorous exercise did not change the oxygen level in his blood. It changed the oxygen level in his cells. And breathing out of that mask really doesn't help anything. It may make him feel a little bit better. It dilates blood vessels, for instance, in your scalp and cranial cavity, which can make you feel more alert. But really, he's not paying back his oxygen debt any quicker by sucking on that oxygen mask. So sucking on that oxygen mask really isn't doing anything for him, except making him feel better. And there's definitely something to be said for psychosomatic, right? Sometimes if something makes you feel better, then it works. So there you go. All right. that is everything that I wanted to talk about for lecture today. So where are we on time? We're doing good. We got at least 2 hours after this break to then get as many of the muscles done as we can today. So that is going to be our game plan. So let's go ahead and stop sharing this for a second. So any questions on that material, fatigue or recovery, before we switch gears into the lab for today? All right, excellent. Then what we are going to do is we are going to take our break. And when we come back, we are going to switch gears into lab. We still had one more muscle we needed to do the origins and insertions for in the arms. So again, it's been a while. So I'll remind you, we need our red and our blue pens or pencils. We need our handouts. And then we will return in 15 minutes, which is going to be 2:25. And I will start the recording at that point. All right. Any questions? All right. See you guys in 15 minutes. Oh, looks like we didn't pause the recording. So hope you guys all enjoyed your 15 minutes of Zen, rest and relaxation and contemplation. All righty, let's go ahead and get started. Again, it's been a while, but if you recall, we left off last time and we were working our way through the origins and the insertions and the actions of the muscles that move our arm. And we'd gotten through almost all of the ones that we need to know the origins and the insertions of, except for one. However, that one happens to be the Triceps Brachii. Being the Triceps Brachii, it means, as the name indicates, 3 heads in the upper arm region. What do we know about a muscle that has multiple heads?
There's a long head and a short head.
Well, there are multiple heads. And in fact, with the triceps, how many do we have?
3.
Excellent. So that means we have 3 individual heads that we need to be able to individually identify. And what else does it tell us we need to know?
All the origins and insertions for it.
Right. However, remember, all 3 are going to have the same insertion. All 3 are going to have the same actions. But do all 3 heads have the same origin?
No.
No. And so remember, if with a multi-head muscle, I want the specific name or the specific origin, there's going to be a magical 2-word phrase that I will use on the exam to remind you that is what I want. And what was that magical 2-word phrase?
Be specific.
There you go. Be specific. Absolutely. So let's be specific. Let us look at the 3 heads of the Triceps Brachii. It's kind of easy to find. The Triceps Brachii is really the only posterior major muscle of the posterior muscle of the upper arm. And as you can see here from our illustration, let's use a different color than that. It has a nice big single tendon that all 3 bellies are going to attach to. And there are indeed 3 bellies. One belly is located here furthest from the midline of the body. And how would we identify a head that was located furthest from the midline of the body?
Lateral head.
Lateral.
All right, so that is going to be our lateral head there in purple. Notice it is both lateral and it is all by itself, so it is lonely, which is how I always remember it. The lateral head is lonely over here by itself. We also have, let's see if brown shows up well. Oh, no, hold on, that needs to stay purple. Excellent. Yep, those 4-sided flashcards can be useful on occasion. Absolutely. Excellent. So next, notice we have this tiny little muscle down here that is closest to the midline. So this tiny little head over here, which happens to also be very small. It's the smallest, so it is mini. And it is closest to midline. So what is this mini muscle that is closest to the midline?
The medial.
Medial head, excellent. And notice both of these muscles, unlike the bicep brachia, remember the bicep brachia doesn't attach to the humerus at all. Both the lateral head and the medial head of the tricep brachia does. However, notice that there is a 3rd head, whoops, no. This 3rd head is so long that it actually goes beyond the humerus and attaches to the scapula. And because this one head is so long that it actually doesn't stay on the humerus and goes all the way to the scapula, then how do we identify the long head? Not your question.
It's long.
Yeah, the head that is long is the long head. There you go. So we have the lonely lateral, the mini medial, and the long long are 3 individual heads for the triceps brachii. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. So since we are comfortable with that, let's go ahead and draw our origins and insertions now. Hold on, I want to make this big. I need to go to there. Perfect. Excellent. Here we go. So luckily I've got 3 different colors of red that I can use, so that will work nicely. So grab that, grab that, grab that. Let's start easy. Long head. Where is the origin of the long head?
The
Scapula.
infraglenoid tubercle?
Absolutely. Remember, the long head originates from this irregular bump underneath the glenoid cavity. So this irregular bump underneath the glenoid cavity, the infraglenoid tubercle. Again, remember, we learned that stupid bump above and the stupid bump below that didn't seem to have any rhyme or reason to them, but now we know why. That little bump underneath the glenoid cavity is the origin for the long head. Excellent. All right, let's go next easy with the medial. So for the medial head, what is the origin of the medial head?
Posterior distal of humerus.
Right. So again, it is posterior, it is medial. And remember, the mini is short, so it doesn't get that far up the humerus. So basically, it sits on this, again, well, this is hard to fill in with that. So let's cheat and make it line a little bigger. It is the triceps brachii. It is a posterior muscle, so it's on the posterior part of the humerus. It is medial, so it's on the medial part of the humerus. And it is mini, so it's on the distal. And so really that's what I think of. It is distal, it is posterior, and medial.
This is the origin, right?
Yes, this is the origin of the medial head. That is correct. Excellent. And that leaves us then with our lateral head. What is the origin of the lateral head?
Posterior proximal end of the humerus.
There you go. Absolutely. Right. It's lateral. So it is going to be obviously lateral on the humerus. It is the triceps brachii. So it is absolutely going to be posterior. And unlike the medial, which is small, this one is going to be more proximal. So the medial head is distal, posterior, and medial. The lateral is lateral, posterior, and proximal. And so again, we can draw that just basically like a triangle on the posterior part of the arm there. And those are our 3 bellies that we need to be specific and name, our 3 origins that we need to be specific and name for the tricep brachii. And again, when I say be specific, I do mean be specific. If on the exam, I were to show you an arm and point at, right, I'll use this one because I don't want to mess up my picture there. If I were to have, oh, it's even better. I have a humerus. And on that humerus, I have an arrow that points to this region right here. And I say, identify the muscle that originates there, be specific. And on the exam, you write medial head is the distal posterior part of the humerus. Long head is on the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula, and lateral head is on the posterior proximal posterior, origin. Then that's not going to be right. Or if you just said tricep brachii, I guess actually the answer would be tricep brachii. It wouldn't be right. I don't want tricep brachii. I want the lateral head of the tricep brachii. If I ask you for the origin, I don't want all the origins. I just want the origin of the specific one I'm pointing at. When I use those terms, be specific. I want you to be precise in your answers. All right. All right. Now, while there are 3 names, while there are 3 origins, how many insertions are there? Just 1. Excellent. And what is the 1 insertion?
The common tendon into the ulcrinin process of the ulna.
And again, remember on the again, what you said is absolutely 100% correct. But remember, you don't technically have to say the common tendon. I have that there to remind you guys that they all come together into a single insertion. So you don't have to put that in your answer, but putting it there is perfectly acceptable as well. There you go. Basically to the bump of the elbow is where it inserts. Notice now in looking at this, thanks to the long head, we can see it crosses 2 joints, both the shoulder and the elbow. Being a posterior muscle, what effect is it going to have on the shoulder?
Extends the forearm and the arm.
Extend.
It's going to extend the shoulder, absolutely. And you're right, because it's a posterior muscle, what effect is it going to have on the elbow? It's going to extend the elbow as well. Remember, it can either be on the movable bone, the radius, that is going to allow it to pronate and supinate, or it can be on the stable bone, the ulna, where it doesn't. Which is it on? Is it on the movable bone or the stable bone?
Stable bone.
Stable bone. So can it pronate or supinate?
No.
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 So notice the tricep brachii only has 2 actions, right? It extends the shoulder and it extends the elbow. Those are its 2 actions. And there you go. Questions on that? All right, excellent. So the good news is, oops, wrong button. The good news is that is all the muscles we need to know the origins and the insertions for. But as you can see, there are still a large number of muscles we need to identify. Starting next with these muscles. And actually, while this is a decent view of these, conveniently enough, in our classroom, we have a model that looks like this. This is actually as part of your handout of classroom models. What we can see here is a bunch of muscles that are associated with the scapula. So again, feel free to cheat by using the handout that you have in front of you, but let's see if we can figure some of these things out. Notice there is a muscle sitting up here in the space above the spine of the scapula. What was that bone feature, that space above the scapula, called?
Suprascapular something.
Oh, close. Supraspinatus fossa.
Oh, yeah.
Fossa, the indentation above the spine of the scapula. So guess what muscle sits in the supraspinatus fossa?
The supraspinatus.
There you go. Excellent, supraspinatus. Perfect. Then notice there is a muscle that sits below the spine of the scapula. Guess what this muscle that sits below the spine of the scapula is?
The subscapularis.
Well, notice I didn't say.
Or no, infraspinatus. Sorry.
There we go. Infraspinatus. Excellent. but you are correct. On the anterior side of the muscle, I mean, on the anterior side of the bone, there was an indentation. Oops, too far. There was an indentation on the anterior or underside of the bone, known as the subscapular fossa. And guess what muscle sits in the subscapular fossa?
The subscapularis.
There you go. See how easy this is?
That's the anterior
Yep.
part.
Yeah. So the excellent. This is, yes. This one here is anterior. And this is the posterior view. And again, the easiest way to tell that is find the spine. Remember, the spine is always on the posterior side of the scapula. So that spine is a dead giveaway. All right. Now, I want you to notice one other thing as well. Notice there is this kind of round band-like muscle. We see it from the back side. We see it from the front side. That actually, you can actually put your finger in and separate, comes apart from itself. Any idea what that muscle might be?
Is that the Teres Minor?
Turns out it's the teres major.
The teres.
However, is the teres major one of the muscles we need to know?
No.
No.
No. So we don't care about it too much, except that the teres minor can help us to find, pardon me, the teres major can help us to find the teres minor. And notice right here underneath the infraspinatus, above the teres major, is our teres minor. So notice here, associated with the shoulder, are these four muscles: the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, the subscapularis, and the teres minor. And notice something interesting about them. Oh, what color haven't I used? I haven't used light blue. Excellent. One of the interesting things about, whoops, no, hold on. That needs to stay yellow. Excellent. So that I can make this light blue. Notice these four muscles, the subscapularis, the teres minor, the infraspinatus, and the supraspinatus, which comes down underneath from the top. These are the only muscles whose tendons wrap around the head of the humerus. You could almost say that they wrap around and support the humerus by forming almost a cuff-like structure that helps to stabilize the head of the humerus and hold it in place. And in fact, these four muscles collectively form a muscle group. And what do you think the name of the muscle group that forms a cuff-like structure around the head of the humerus might be?
The rotator cuff.
Exactly. These four muscles form your rotator cuff. Again, baseball season started last week. So it's any minute now, some pitcher is going to come down with a rotator cuff injury. And this is typically what it involves. Typically the stretching or the tearing of the tendons of one of these four muscles, or a strain of the muscles of one of these four muscles. So these four muscles together form collectively our rotator cuff, stabilizing and supporting that head of the humerus in place. All right. Questions on that? So know what the rotator cuff is and know the four individual muscles that help to form it. All right. Ooh, let's do one more thing. This, notice we can see it because, again, it comes over the top. We can see the supraspinatus coming down and its tendon coming underneath the acromion that way as well. So we can see that sneaking there as well because at the top. All right, excellent. Those are the four muscles. We know them now as a group. We know their individual names. While we don't need to know their origins and insertions, we do need to be able to identify them on a bone like this or know where they would sit in a bone like this. So we know that. So the last thing we need to do is understand their actions. So let's start easy. Supraspinatus basically comes right over the top, not to the front, not to the back, just right over to the top. So it's essentially kind of a superior but also lateral muscle. So when this muscle contracts, guess what it does to the arm?
AB ducts arm.
Yeah, brings it straight out to the side. It abducts the arm. All right. Remember, the deltoid does that as well. This one only does it about 15 degrees. We were talking about tricks to help you to remember this. If you were at a wedding doing that chicken dance, right, that ability to do that about 15, 20 degree abduction of the arm is what that supraspinatus is good for. Subscapularis doesn't have a spine in the way, so it can basically come straight across and help to form the front clamp of that rotator cuff. So when it pulls on the muscle, what does it do to the humerus?
Rotates it medially.
Rotates it medially, absolutely. So it just has one action as well. The infraspinatus, because of the spine, is coming up at an angle. Now it's on the back, so an obvious function of it, because again, it's forming that cuff, is it's going to laterally rotate the scapula. But not only does it laterally rotate the arm, but what else does it do to the arm?
It deducts there.
It deducts it. So notice it brings the arm in and rotates it out. Right? This is the one that I always think of in terms of, I don't think I can get far enough away from the camera, right? At the end of my fancy routines, I always go out for my jazz hands, right? So you adduct, lateral rotate, jazz hands, right? So that ability to be able to do that, you've got that. And notice the smallest muscle, the teres minor, is the one at the most extreme angle. And because it's more at an angle, it gets 3 actions. Not surprisingly, it's right under the infraspinatus, so it is also going to adduct. It is also going to laterally rotate, but because it's more angled, it gets a 3rd action. And what's the 3rd action?
Extend.
Extend, so brings it back. All right. So again, remember we were talking about tennis. If you're getting ready to take that forehand swing, right, you want to protect the elbow, so you want to bring it in. Right, adduct, you need to get your racket out and you need to bring it back so that you're ready to take that forehand swing. So those 3 actions of the teres minor. All right. Questions on this?
Can you point to teres minor again? Do we see it, or is it one of those deeper muscles?
No, teres minor is right here. It's on the posterior side underneath the infraspinatus.
Okay. Why does it say teres major right underneath it?
Because if you watch, I'm going to clear my drawings. If you look closely, I'll use a fine point. This right here is the teres minor. And notice underneath the teres minor, you can see a little bit of the teres major. Notice the teres major comes from the very bottom, the inferior angle of the scapula. Notice you can see it here on the anterior side. This is the teres major. The teres major is more of an anterior muscle that starts at the bottom and comes its way up. But because it's so inferior, we can see a little bit sticking out there. So the teres major is slightly separate from the teres minor, and so we can see it there. So the pink is the teres major, front and back, but the teres minor you only see from the back.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And again, this is a model we actually have in the classroom, but your book does a decent job of showing these things as well. Here we see the supraspinatus coming up from the top, subscapularis on the front. Here from the back, and see, notice here, what I like about this is they have really done a better job of exaggerating how the teres major really does separate itself from the rotator cuff. It's not a part of the rotator cuff. It doesn't attach to the head of the humerus, and there is a gap, there is a space in between. So up here, and I'll change colors, we see the small teres minor right here, and then the rest of this is all the infraspinatus. So we have the infraspinatus here, teres minor there, and then across the gap is the teres major. And again, teres major is not one of the muscles that you are responsible for on the exam, but it is a great landmark that you can use to find the other muscles. And notice also, you can see here again, the long head of the Triceps Brachii actually separates the teres minor from the teres major because it goes up underneath, keeping the teres major to the front and the teres minor to the back. And then, of course, up here we see the supraspinatus as well. Excellent. So those are the 4 muscles of our 4 muscles of our rotator cuff. Now, what that leaves us with is the forearm. And especially when you look at a handout like the one we have here on the like the one that we have here in your illustration in your textbook, the forearm can be intimidating because there are dozens of muscles located in the forearm. What I will remind you is you are only responsible for 6 forearm muscles, 3 that are anterior and 3 that are posterior, and all of them are superficial. The real key to identifying the forearm muscles is to follow the tendons. The tendons will tell you everything you need to know about the forearms. Let's take a look at something here. Oops, wrong button. Not you, I want that. Okay, this is a good one. Before we look at the pretty pictures from your textbook, let's look at one of the models. This picture of a model comes from that CRC virtual anatomy lab. And notice we are looking at the posterior part of the arm. This is a posterior view of the arm. So let's write that. Does the black show up on this gray? Not really. There, it shows up a little bit nicer. One of the first keys that is going to make it easiest to do as you are learning the arm is to get a starting point. And remember, we have that brachioradialis muscle, that muscle that lines up perfectly with the thumb. It looks like it might be a forearm muscle, but really, as we've learned, it's that one that moves the elbow. So one of the easiest things to do to get yourself started is to find that muscle first. And lo and behold, that's a little small. Let's try, see if that's better. Like that a little better. That right there, that muscle lining up perfectly with the thumb. Find the thumb, you find the brachioradialis. And if you can find the brachioradialis, you're going to be able to find all the other muscles you are going to be responsible for on the arm. Let's just work our way around from there. Starting first with the muscle that sits right next to it. Notice as you look at this muscle, and I will highlight this in purple, it has a relatively short belly and a long tendon that comes all the way here to the back of the thumb. So This is a muscle that is on the posterior side. So if you're on the posterior side, are you more likely to be a flexor or are you more likely to be extensor?
Extender.
Excellent. So this one is an extensor. Now, what's extending is the wrist. And what bones form the wrist again?
Carpals.
Carpals. So extensor carpi. Is it on the thumb side or the pinky side?
Thumb side.
Thumb side. So is that the radius or the ulna?
Radius.
Radius. And this one has a short belly and a long tendon. And remember, we mentioned muscles that tend to have long tendons are called longus muscles. And lo and behold, right next to our brachioradialis, we have our arm muscle with the longest name. But that long name tells you everything about it. It is the extensor carpi radialis longus. It's a posterior muscle, so it extends. It extends the wrists. It's on the thumb side, and it has a short body and a long tendon. So just that easily, by looking at the tendon, seeing it has a long tendon, seeing it's on the back side, seeing that it goes to the thumb, it told us what this muscle was. Now, if we've learned anything else, it's that if we have longuses, we're going to also have shortuses. Of course, it's not going to be a shortus, it's the brevis. And sure enough, this muscle right next to it is the extensor carpi radialis brevis. However, is that muscle on our list?
No.
No, so we don't care. What we do care about, though, is the very next muscle. Again, notice when I look up here at the muscle itself doesn't tell me much. But if I follow its tendon, notice that its tendon splits to go to not just one, but 2, 3 different fingers. So this muscle on the back side of the hand, and because it's on the back side of the hand, we said would extend and goes to not 1, not 2, but 3 different fingers. Guess what we call this muscle?
Is that the extensor digitorum?
Right, because it extends the digits. Our extensor digitorum. Excellent. Now, notice it doesn't go to the thumb. The thumb has a handful of muscles that move it. You're not responsible for any of them. It's a very special joint with that opposable thumb. But notice it also doesn't go to the pinky, right? And as we know, of course, Dr. Evil likes to use the pinky when he's talking about his $1 billion, right? And so not surprisingly, that's the extensor digitorum minimus, right? Because Dr. Evil's got mini-me. But again, do we care? Is the extensor digitorum minimus on our list? No. So we hop over it, and that brings us to our third and final muscle. Nope. Third and final muscle we need to be able to recognize on the posterior side of the arm. And in this case, as we look at it, blue. Better. Notice again, when we look at the muscle itself, it doesn't tell us much, but notice it has a tendon that goes behind the bump that you feel on the side of your hand. Right next to your hand, on the pinky side, there's that bump. That's that styloid process of the ulna. This tendon comes behind it, and because it comes behind it, it's going to be able to extend the hand. But this muscle is not connected to the thumb, connected to the pinky. So guess how we identify this muscle that extends the wrist on the pinky side of the hand?
The extensor carpi ulnaris.
And there you go. just that simply, using our brachioradialis as our starting point, we have found the three muscles on the backside of the hand, the backside of the forearm, that we need to be able to identify. The extensor carpi radialis longus, the extensor digitorum, and the extensor carpi ulnaris. We found a starting point, we followed the tendons. And if you do those two things, you can find out where you are. All right. Questions on this? All right. Since we're here then and you're all quiet, let's figure out actions. These are all extensors. So what do? What action do all of these have in common?
Extend.
Extend.
Extend the wrist, right? And if they're all going to extend, and remember, we always assume anatomical position. So that's an extension, and that's an extension, and that's an extension, and that's an extension, and that's an extension, right? However I hold my hand, that is an extension. Extension brings it back. Excellent. Extensor digitorum does what?
Extends the phalanges.
Yeah, extends the digits. And now we know digits 2, 3, and 4. All right, it's going to extend those. All right. Extensor carpes extend the wrist. But the extensor carpi radialis longus is on the radius side. So when it contracts, not only can it extend the wrist, but it can also tilt the hand towards the thumb side, which of course in anatomical position would be away from the body. So what type of action did I just do there? What was that?
Abduct.
Abduction. No, it's an abduction, not abduction, moving away. Whereas the ulnaris, being on the pinky side, does what?
Adducts.
Adducts. There you go. So our extensor carpi ulnaris extends and adducts the wrist. Our extensor carpi radialis longus extends and abducts the wrist. And the extensor digitorum extends the wrist and the digits. And there you go. We've identified the three muscles and we've identified the actions of the three muscles on the back of the arm. And when you break it down like that, it ain't too scary. So let's do the same thing on the front of the arm. Excellent. We need a starting point. And luckily, again, lining smack dab up with our thumb. No, let's keep it white. Is once again our brachioradialis. All right. Now notice when you look at your, and we'll get to the muscles in just a second, but when you look at, what color will work? Let's see a green. If you look closely, you will see that there is 1, 2, 3 prominent tendons that can stick up on your forearm, on your wrist. And many of you can get at least one of these to stand up. I don't know how well this will translate to the camera, but if you flex and twist, you can see 1, 2, 3. You can see those 3 tendons that are standing up on my wrist that are prominent and sticking up. And those are the 3 muscles we are going to be looking for. Those 3 muscles for those 3 tendons. You should be able to at least get one of those to stand out, especially on your right hand. They sometimes can be missing on your left, but you should be able to get at least one of those to stick out pretty prominently when you flex and twist it like that. And that's what we're looking for. So we found our 3 tendons, although let's change the colors so that there's no confusion. And start with this one first. Notice this one is a muscle that has a tendon, and that tendon goes to the thumb on the front side of the forearm. So based on that piece of information, how do you think we identify this muscle with a tendon on the anterior part of the hand, the forearm that goes to the thumb.
It flexes.
It's going to flex. And what does it flex?
The carpals.
Yep.
So
And it goes to
carpi.
the thumb side. So it's
Radial, so radialis.
there you go. Flexor carpi radialis. Oops. Stop it. There you go. Just that simple. Let's find the second tendon. Second tendon, notice, is this one, the very prominent one that points right at the palm of the hand. And notice this one has a relatively small belly and a long tendon that points all the way to the palm of the hand. So guess how we identify this muscle?
Palmaris longus.
There you go. See how simple this game is? And we had a flexor carpi radialis that points at the thumb. Notice we also have a tendon, and notice the muscle belly is really on the lateral side. It almost starts a little bit on the posterior side, but it isn't about where the muscle is, it's about where the tendon is. And this tendon comes to the front on the pinky side. So this muscle that comes to, this muscle that comes to the front on the pinky side, what do we call it?
The flexor carpi ulnaris.
And there you go. Just that simply, we have identified the 3 superficial anterior muscles of the forearm that we need. And all 3 are flexors, so they all flex the hand. The flexor carpi ulnaris, being on the pinky side, flexes the hand and also tilts it to the pinky side, which is what type of action again?
Adduct.
Adducts. And the flexor carpi radialis flexes and tilts the hand towards the thumb side, which is an
Abduction.
abduct.
I'm sorry, adduction.
Well, again, you said it correctly. I do the B's and the D's because I really want to emphasize the difference.
I do it too at work, and I work at a physical therapy office, and it bothers my boss a lot, but it's the only way I can remember it.
It's what helps me as well, but yeah, so yeah, absolutely. So there you go. 6 muscles of the forearm, follow their tendons, and they tell you exactly what they do. And then once you find that landmark of the brachioradialis, you can find your way around. A lot of people struggle with the forearm. A lot of people are intimidated by the forearm, but if you really take the time to do this, it will work for you, okay? So spend a little time with it, and this will absolutely positively work. Notice we can do this exact same thing on the picture from your textbook. Again, we start at the brachioradialis, lines up with the thumb. We're starting on a posterior view. Right next to it, short muscle, long tendon goes to the back of the thumb. Extensor carpi radialis longus. Of course, next to that is the brevis, which you don't care about. So we hop to the next one. And again, there's nothing up here special about this. But if we follow it down, it's tendon splits going to 3 of the digits. So that is our extensor digitorum. Of course, there's the extensor digitorum minimi, again, going to the pinky, which we don't care about right next to it. But next to that is the muscle that goes behind the styloid process of the elbow, of the ulna, extensor carpi ulnaris. And notice this one does a nice job of showing us how the muscle for the flexor carpi ulnaris is more on the lateral or almost posterior side of the arm. I'll get to that in a second. Posterior and lateral side of the arm, but we don't care where the muscle is, it's where the tendon goes. The tendon goes to the front. And so even though the muscle's mostly on the back of the arm, the tendon goes to the front. And so that is our flexor carpi ulnaris. Here we see the anterior view. Again, we don't see much of the muscle, but what we do see is its tendon. It's prominent tendon coming to the front of the hand. So that's the flexor carpi ulnaris. Oops. From that, we have small bellied muscle, long tendon that goes right smack dab to the front of the hand, palmaris longus. Next to that, flexor carpi radialis, tendon goes to the thumb. And then right from there, we're right back where we started at the brachioradialis. So in that case, we were able to go all the way around in a circle around the forearm and identify the muscles. Now, to answer your question, and let's go back to the previous picture to see this. There are a lot of tendons from a lot of muscles going to the hand, right? And if you think about it, if you tied a string to the hand and to your elbow, and then you extended the elbow, that string would stick out. We don't want our tendons to stick out like that. So luckily, there's a connective tissue cuff that holds most of the tendons in place. And notice here on the posterior side, that cuff is the extensor retiniculum, helping to stabilize those tendons and hold it in place. So retiniculum is just a fibrous connective tissue cuff to stabilize the tendons. And on the anterior side, we see the flexor retiniculum as well. Now, I do want to show you one interesting thing. Notice that palmaris longus's tendon isn't stabilized by the flexor retiniculum. So when you flex your hand, almost everybody, especially on your right hand, should be able to see at least one tendon that sticks out. Notice I keep saying the right hand because in some individuals and in right-handed people, as much as 30% in some cases, that muscle fuses with others and they don't actually have a palmaris longus on their left side. So if you don't see one on your left, but you see one on your right, you may be one of those people who don't have a palmaris longus. But if you have a palmaris longus, its tendon is not stabilized by the flexor retiniculum. And so as a result of that, it typically stands out more prominently. And there you go. Just that easily, we have identified all of the muscles we need to know for the arm. Muscles, origins, insertions, actions, and structures. Questions on that? Stunned silences. Excellent. I love that. All right. Good news is we only have one more part of the body to go, the leg. Bad news is there's a lot we need to cover there. Yes, Laura, question.
You said, I'm sorry, you said the flexor retiniculum?
Yes.
And the palmaris longus, does it fuse to that one when you said we can't see it?
No, so great. So the flexor retiniculum tends to be slightly deeper. So what ends up happening is the tendon for the palmaris longus actually goes over the top. It comes over the top of it. So it's not held in place. So when you flex, it can actually stand out more, especially when you flex your fingers as well. That palmaris longus tendon can stand out more. However, not 100% of people have a palmaris longus muscle in both arms. For whatever reason, just during development and growth, it fuses for some people with some of the muscles underneath. So because it fuses with some of the muscles underneath, it doesn't have its own independent tendon in some people. So for some people, when they go to try to flex it, they don't really see a tendon there. It doesn't really stick out as much because it's become a part of the other muscles, and so it doesn't stand out as prominently.
But that doesn't limit you to like doing anything.
No, it doesn't affect anything at all as far as function or strength or anything else. No difference at all. Yep. All right. Excellent question. Any others? All right, that is the arm and everything that goes along with that. We are on to the leg next, and we got a lot of work. We're not going to get it all done today, but let's take a quick 10-minute break just to cleanse the palate. As Ariana said, her mind is already blown. So let's take a 10-minute break, digest that forearm stuff. So actually, let's go back to the forearm stuff. And from there, we will take a quick 10-minute break, come back at 3:25, and at 3:25, we will, oops, now I got to switch back to black. 3:25. We will restart and see how far into the leg we can get, because the more we can get today, the less we have on Thursday. All right, guys, see you in 10 minutes. Quick 10-minute break, not a normal 15-minute break, just a quick 10-minute break, stretch, cry, get a drink, whatever it is you need to do. I will see you in 10 minutes. Let's go ahead and finish things off for today. Now, again, I appreciate what you guys are saying. And again, I fully appreciate how much information I'm throwing at you with these things. But remember, the goal of us doing this together isn't so that when I'm done talking at the end of the day, you should have this information mastered. Right? That's not the point of this. The point of this is for you to be exposed to this information so that having some experience going over it together, having me provide you with some of the tricks that I use to help to master this information, hopefully should help you when you're working on this on your own to be successful learning this. So again, the goal of the lectures aren't for you to master the information. It's for me to expose you to it so that you can be successful moving forward from that. So that is the goal. So again, I just want to remind you of that. All right, we are on to the leg, starting first with everybody's favorite muscle, the gluteus maximus. Excellent. It is I always get in trouble when I say this, but it is a prominent superficial posterior muscle, right? It makes up our posterior. However, if you look especially at the orientation of the fascicles, you can see that while it is a posterior muscle, it has a very distinct medial to lateral, superior to inferior projection of the fascicles that are useful to help us to understand what it is that this muscle does. All right, so let's take a look at the origin and the insertion of this to help us to understand this. Let's start first with the origin. What is the origin of the gluteus maximus?
So sacrum and coccyx.
Excellent. So the sacrum, coccyx, and what else?
The dorsal ilium.
Right, the dorsal ilium, right? Kind of up here on the crest. So the dorsal, so again, it really is posterior, not all the way kind of up to the crest. I may have gone a little too far with that. But dorsal ilium along the sacrum, along the coccyx, it is a truly posterior muscle with a very medial origin. And what is its insertion?
Gluteal tuberosity and iliotibial band tract.
Excellent. So again, remember we have that nice triangular roughened attachment point on the back side of, wow, that really looks horrible. This roughened up V-shape extension of the linea aspera, that triangle roughened attachment point that is the gluteus gluteal tuberosity. Absolutely. So we definitely have that. But notice if you look closely at the actual muscle itself, that isn't actually where most of it inserts. So I need to switch pictures. So any questions on this before I switch back to the other picture? All right, silence always golden. Here, let's take a look at this and let's get a little bit closer. Notice as we look a little closer at this muscle, we can see how, yes, some of the fascicles are coming in and inserting into that triangular gluteal tuberosity on the back of the femur. But notice a lot of the fascicles are coming and attaching to this thickened piece of connective tissue that runs all the way up from the crest of the coccyx bone, all the way down to the tibia. Right? It's the IT band, iliotibial band. Right? This iliotibial band is a thickened piece of connective tissue along the lateral axis of the leg that helps and plays an important role in both stabilizing the muscles, but also helping to provide support and structure for the muscles as well. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. So you can see that, yes, there is a bony insertion for it, but it also inserts into this big tendon-like structure known as the iliotibial band. All right, questions on that? Now, the reason I emphasize this is to emphasize its actions. How many actions does this muscle have?
2.
2. Being a posterior muscle, what is the most obvious action that it's going to have?
Extension. Extending.
Yeah, exactly. Extends the hip, right? It is absolutely going to extend the hip. But notice it also pulls on the leg, pulling the leg from the side, from lateral to medial. So what is the other action that it has as well?
I can't talk. Laterally rotating the thigh.
Yeah. Now, again, notice obviously this isn't my arm. I mean, this isn't my leg, but it is my arm. If you think of the backside of the gluteus medius pulling on the back of the leg, as the front of the leg moves away from the midline, right? Basically, what it would do is it would turn the feet outwards, right? So again, you put your feet together, you turn the feet outward. I think if I remember correctly, when my daughters took ballet, isn't that like second position or something like that?
That's
That's
First position. There you go. It's been a while. They were much, much younger then, and cute then. They're not so much so now. But yeah, so exactly. Putting the feet together with your legs extended and the laterally rotating the feet out, that would be that function of the gluteus maximus. All right. Again, posterior muscle, and we see that in its actions. I make a point of emphasizing this because, of course, if there's a gluteus maximus, what else is there?
Gluteus medius.
Well, true. There's also
like a gluteus minor, but we don't really talk about
minimus. There's a minimus, but you're not responsible for that. But you are correct that there is one in between, a gluteus medius that you're responsible for. And while the gluteus maximus is a posterior muscle, the gluteus medius is a lateral muscle. And again, one of the ways we truly see this is by looking at its origin and its insertion. What is the origin of the gluteus medius?
The lateral surface of the ilium.
Yep, the lateral surface of the ilium. Basically, not all the way up to the crest. But basically here, I'm going to cheat and use a thicker line here. Not all the way up to the crest, but this indentation, this fossa on the lateral aspect of the ilium. No offense, but whoever's doing dishes, I'm going to mute everybody. So again, feel free to unmute yourself, but I don't want to hear the dishes being put away. On the lateral aspect of the ilium, not all the way up to the crest, but on that lateral aspect. And of course, it inserts into the lateralist most point of the hip. And as we learned way back in the bones, what is the lateral most point of the hip?
the greater trochanter.
Yeah, the greater trochanter of the femur. So right here, we have that lateral origin and the lateral insertion, making this a lateral muscle. Being a lateral muscle, what's its most obvious action of the leg going to be?
abduction.
Yeah, abduction. Pull the leg out. However, it is slightly angled as well, so it does get some other action as well. What else does it do besides laterally abducting the leg?
Medially rotating the thigh, or
Immediately
like the leg, I
rotates-
guess.
Yeah, immediately rotates it as well. So basically, it'd be like sticking your leg out and then turning it so that your toes pointed down and your heel pointed up. That would basically be the action of the gluteus medius. Anybody come up with something good that you would use that for? I know I told you guys, and you guys have been working on your handouts. Anyone come up with something clever to help us remember the gluteus medius?
Splits.
Okay, certainly, absolutely. If you're doing a split, especially if you were supported by something where you could basically turn your legs outward like that as well. I always, again, go back to thinking of it in terms of groceries. When I'm carrying all those big bags of groceries in and the kids go running in the house, being the children that they are, do they hold the door open for dear old dad so that he can get in?
No.
No, of course
Never.
not. So basically what you have to do is you have to swing your leg out and kind of grab it with your heel. And so that ability to kick your leg out and immediately rotate it so you can grab the door with your heel and kind of keep it and then pull it open. That's kind of what I always think of when I think of this muscle, that ability to be able to do that. And I'm sure there's some dance move or something that goes along with that as well. But there you go. All right. So that is the gluteus medius. Notice, like the deltoid, the gluteus medius is a prominent, thick, medial muscle, which is one of the reasons why these are the muscles that are typically used for intermuscular injections. Right? In the movies, right, everybody's always putting into the gluteus maximus because in the movies, that's way more funny, right? When you're taking the shot and giving it to them in their butt. But there are three things you need to worry about when you are giving an injection. When you're giving an intermuscular injection, you have to have a muscle that is large enough to accept the bolus of medicine. You need to have the right blood supply to it so that the medicine gets diffused quickly, but not too quickly. And the other thing you have to worry about is you don't want to damage any major nerves. And so while the gluteus maximus definitely has the mass, definitely has the blood supply, the gluteus maximus also is very close to the largest nerve of the body. This large nerve of the body comes out underneath the greater sciatic notch and goes all the way down the posterior part of the leg to the foot. And what is that longest nerve of the body?
Sciatic nerve.
Sciatica.
Sciatic nerve, absolutely. So there's danger of hitting that sciatic nerve. So instead, what people typically do is you feel the iliac crest, go about 2 inches down from the iliac crest, and you make the injection there or in the arm. Now, again, we're talking adults. In kids, these muscles aren't necessarily big enough to accept the bolus. So when the kids get their vaccines, typically it's into the quadricep muscles where you're making the injection. But in adults, typically it's either the deltoid muscle or the gluteus medius that are used to accept the bolus from those intermuscular injections. All right. Questions on that? So again, it's all fun and games in the movies to do it in the butt, but that's not where they really do it.
What?
Give the injection in the butt, you children. God, if you can't handle this, just wait till 431 when we're talking reproductive system.
Jeez.
You all knew what I meant.
But you said it. You set us up.
I guess I did. That wasn't intentional. All right. Anyway, let us move on to our first muscle group of the leg that I want to talk about, and that is the hamstrings. One of the first things easy to identify the posterior part of the leg is that you want to look for this diamond shape. Let me use a prominent color that stands out. This diamond shaped region located in the posterior part of the leg known as the popliteal fossa. Right. With that, notice this diamond shape is basically formed by the four muscles coming together. We have the two heads of the gastrocnemius, or calf muscle, that form the bottom part. we have our bicep femoris, which comes down this way, and our semimembranosus and semitendinosus that come down that way. They form this diamond-shaped region that is called the popliteal fossa. And that's actually where the hamstrings get their name. The anatomy of a pig is, and the musculature of a pig's leg is very similar to the muscular of a human's leg. So when they're butchering the pig for meat, the leg, which is typically cured for ham, what they do is they take a big, large meat hook, they stick it through this popliteal fossa into the muscle, and they hang it inside of the drying racks to cure the meat. So it's literally where they string up the ham from. And so that's where it gets its name. The hamstrings are where the meat is strung up to cure it into ham. Now, we need to know them as a muscle group, but notice we also need to know the three names of them. Yes, exactly. Yes. Nope. Yeah, I do. I don't have a smoker, although I should have one. Absolutely. Well, look, again, as I've said many times in this class, we can have the philosophical debate as to whether or not meat is murder, right? For those of you who are vegetarian and vegan, we could have that discussion if you want to. But the one thing you cannot debate is that meat is muscle, right? Meat is absolutely muscle, and we will do that way. All right, excellent. So the first muscle is a biceps muscle, the bicep in the femoral region. And of course, what does that tell you when it is a biceps?
There's
Two
two
heads.
heads.
Two heads, yes.
Absolutely. In some way, the biceps femoris is similar to the bicep brachia in that they're two heads, and they're indeed the long head and the short head. However, remember in the bicep brachia, the two bellies are side by side, sitting next to each other. Here in the bicep femoris, there is one superficial and one deep. So they're different in their orientation that way. I don't know what ham stands for, honestly. A ham is the cut of meat, I think, the cured cut of meat. It's when they string up the leg to turn it into ham, right? Many of you had it for Easter a couple days ago. All right. Two heads. So again, we want to be specific when we're talking about these two heads. Here we see the long head, and deep to it, which I'll show you in just a minute, we can see the short head of it as well. Now remember, the hamstring is a muscle group. Being a muscle group, what were the terms? How did we define a muscle group, by the way? What were the criteria that were necessary for muscles to be considered part of a muscle group?
Where they all don't they all connect similarly in the same places?
Yeah. Obviously,
same insertion.
Got to be two, exactly, two or more muscles, obviously for a group, duh. But you're absolutely right. They must share one or let's say it this way, must share at least one attachment. That attachment can be either the origin or the insertion. It could be one or the other. It must share at least one, and they must be similar but not identical in action. So those are the three criteria that we need. For our hamstring, the shared attachment is going to be the origin. So the origin is the shared attachment. And for the biceps, it's the bicep femoris. So let's take a look at them first. Here we see the long head, and notice, oops, where is it? No, come on. Where's my deep? Do I not have it on this? Interesting. All right. Well, here, let's see if they've got it. Let's see if they've got it on the leg models. All right, there's the posterior thigh. They don't have it there either. Excellent. Well, luckily for you, because being the clever fellow that I am, made some of these available on our website. So if we go to there we go. This is what we want. Okay. On Canvas, in your modules, one of the handouts that is available is a leg model. Notice this one does a great job of showing us that iliotibial band we were just talking about. So notice here you can see the iliotibial band that goes all the way from the ilium down to the tibia where it connects down there. So this nice big white strip, one of the structures you are responsible for on the exam. Excellent. Okay, this one will work. Here we have a deep view of the back of the leg. And this particular view allows us to see the short head of the bicep femoris. This is the short head of the bicep femoris. The long head basically sits right over the top. So basically it comes and sits right over the top and connects right to here like that. And so it sits right over the top of it. So the best way to see it is to see where it's been removed. So here, the long head has been removed and we can see the short head deep underneath it. Now, it doesn't mean that on that previous image you can't see it. When we look here, what you will notice when we look at the bicep femoris is there is just a little bit of its head that'll stick out. And actually, I think the model, let's go back to the model from here. That will work. That's mine. Where is, too many windows open at this point. That's what I want. All right, it's a little trickier on this picture, but that's kind of the point, I guess. So here, if we take these two side by side, here we see the model and we see the gluteus maximus has been removed. But what we are able to very clearly see on this particular image is the long head of the bicep femoris. What is the origin of the bicep femoris?
Of the ischial tuberosity and the short head of the lineal spora.
Excellent. So here it is up on the ischial tuberosity. We'll draw them in a second on the pictures, but I just want to show you here. Up here on the ischial tuberosity, basically, right, that bone that we sit on that supports our weight, we have its origin there, and it comes down, sitting over the top and projects down, going out laterally on the leg towards the iliotibial band. Notice if we peel that off and move it away, we get this view here. Now it's rotated, unfortunately, but let's, there we go. Now it's projected in the same direction, so it's easier for us to go back and forth. Notice again, here would be where that long head originated, and here's where the long head inserts. And notice here, direct, so it would go from here like that. and notice deep to it, this one right here, is the short head. So the short head is directly underneath the long head. It is deep. We actually see just the teeniest bit of it. If we go back to that superficial view, you will see, if you look very closely, you can see this little bit of muscle sticking out here to the side. That little bit of muscle you see sticking out to the side, that is the short head. But as you can see, the long head pretty much almost covers it entirely. It is very hard to see that short head. We just see a teeny bit of it here. So the best way to view it is we have to peel off that long head, and then we're able to see it underneath. We can get a better appreciation for this if we draw the origins and the insertions. So notice we draw the origins and insertions for the bicep femoris. Give me, I know I asked for it, but give it to me again. What was the origin for the long head? Ischial tuberosity. So it's right up here on the ischial tuberosity. That is our long head. And what did you say the origin of the short head was again?
The linea aspera.
Yeah, exactly.
Asparagus.
Yeah, the asparagus line, exactly. Right, that raised ridge that was on the back that had a little bit of a fuzzy top. Right below where it then became the gluteal tuberosity. So this is the origin of the short head. The linea aspera. Now, two different heads, two different names, but one insertion. And what is the one insertion for both of these?
Common tendon into head of fibula and lateral condyle of tibia.
Yep. So basically over here onto the lateral aspect of the leg. So notice if we were to go in and draw, here is the short head, where basically the short head would sit right like this. And then in green, sitting over the top, would be the long head. So you can see why it sits right on top. When we draw the origin insertion, we can see why we don't really see the short head unless the long head is removed. So while it is a bicep on the upper part of the leg, here we have a bicep on the upper part of the arm, but here the heads are side by side, and in the leg, one's superficial and one's deep.
What was the green line again?
Just the belly. I was trying to show the belly of the long head, and the black line is the belly of the short head. So I was just kind of showing how they would sit on top of each other. When you drew a muscle around their origins and insertions, you would see how one sits on top of the other. So that was all I was trying to show.
Okay.
Okay. All right, excellent. So we've identified the muscles. We have identified their origins, each and their single insertion. How many joints do we cross here?
Two.
Hip and the knee. Being a posterior muscle, what effect is it going to have on the hip?
It's going to allow it to extend.
Extend.
Or abduct. No.
Extend. Posterior extends. However, it also crosses that wonky knee. The posterior on the knee does what?
Flexes the knee so it bends it backwards.
Yeah, exactly. So it bends it backwards. Excellent. So again, this I will stand up for. Right? Can you see my legs? Excellent. So extending the hip, bringing it down, flexing the knee, bringing it up. Now notice also, because of the way this muscle is oriented, the job of it is to bring the insertion towards the origin. And when it does that, it is going to twist the leg. And so when it twists the leg, the anterior part moves away from the anterior part moves away. So that would be was it a lateral rotation? Yeah, it would be a lateral rotation. Absolutely. It would laterally rotate it. Bring the lateral part towards the back. Excellent. So it would laterally rotate the leg. Did anybody come up with something clever for what they would use this for? How we can remember all three of these actions?
Kicking the soccer ball.
Soccer ball is not bad. The thing that I always remember for this one, my daughter, when she was really young, when she was young, she had a tremendous amount of energy. So whenever we wanted her to calm down, we wanted her to sit down, we would tell her to sit down, sit crisscross applesauce. Now, I won't actually be able to demonstrate this for you, but you'll be able to at least see the beginning part of it. What she would do when we told her to sit crisscross applesauce is she would actually kick herself in the back of the knee so that she would collapse down into the crisscross applesauce position. Now, if I tried that, I'd probably end up in the hospital right now. But if you think about that action, she has to extend the hip, she has to flex the knee, and when she laterally rotates the leg, the other foot comes behind my other knee, hits me in the back, and I could go down. So that's what we're talking about. Extending the hip, flexing the knee, laterally rotating, and that allows me to collapse down in that crisscross applesauce type of position. All right. Extend the hip, flex the knee, laterally rotate the hip. Questions on that? All right. While we're here for comparison, let's draw the origins and the insertions of the other two muscles. Like the bicep femoris, where we have a superficial belly and an inferior belly, on the other side, the hamstring, we have two muscles, one superficial and one deep as well. The superficial muscle, and the way I remember it is it's superficial, so it is on top. The muscle that is on top is the semitendinosus. So it is the semitendinosus, which is the muscle on top. It is the superficial muscle, semitendinosus. What is the origin of the semitendinosus?
The ischial tuberosity.
Ischial tuberosity, excellent. What is the insertion of the semitendinosus?
The proximal medial surface of the tibia.
Basically right here. Excellent. So the semitendinosus, and it's on top, I'll draw it in green, basically comes down like that. Notice, like the bicep brachia, it is a posterior muscle crossing both the hip and the knee. So it is going to extend the hip and flex the knee. But this one attaches to the medial side. So it's going to pull and actually medially rotate the leg. So when I medially rotate the leg, instead of my leg going behind my other one, so I can extend the hip, flex the knee, and when I medially rotate it, my foot goes out. What do you use this for? These are the kind of questions you need to answer for this muscle activity, right? Which I'm sure all of you have got mostly done because you had this whole week off. Well, again, no, actually, that's not a bad guess. The true love kiss is actually a different one. That is the gastrocnemius. We'll get to the gastrocnemius a little bit later. So you're right. We are going to get to that one. True love's kiss is one of the actions of the legs, but it's but not this one. Now, this is the one, again, kicking a ball, or really more kicking a hacky sack, right? Because you're kind of kicking your foot out to the side. Or the example I always think of is, again, being an older sibling, I'm required by law to torture my younger siblings. And so like at the family reunions and things like that, and Easter's past, we had this big, huge family reunion where we all got together, right? Grandma was on death's door. She didn't think she was going to be able to get to another one. So she wanted to get the whole family together and get us all together for a picture. And we're all standing there, got a professional photographer. And right as he calls out 1, 2, 3, right? Being the younger sibling, the older sibling, what did I do? I whacked my sister sitting next to me, and she stumbled forward, messed up the picture, right? Everybody got mad and yelled. Grandma was crying. All of those things for me whacking her in the back, right? With my foot. And to do that, I had to extend my foot, flex my knee, and then I had to immediately rotate it to kick my foot out and kick her in the butt, knock her over. So there you go, right? Basically similar actions, but not identical. Now, while we're here talking about that superficial semitendinosus sitting on top, we also have the deeper semimembranosus. And what is the origin of the semimembranosus?
It's the same. It's also ischial tuberosity.
Yeah, notice it is the exact same origin. Whoops. And what's its insertion?
Medial condyle of tibia.
So notice pretty much the exact same insertion. They basically sit one right on top of each other with the exact same origins, the exact same insertions. So if they have the exact same origins and the exact same insertions, guess what else is identical?
Their actions.
Their actions. And notice they all, so again, for these two muscles, their origins, insertions are the same. And when we look at this on the illustration, when we look at this on the picture from both the textbook and from the model, let's go back to the, here we go. So here on the medial aspect, we have the tendinosus, which is this shorter one on top or smaller one on top, and it sits directly on top of the slightly wider and deeper semimembranosus underneath. So these two muscles literally sit right on top of each other. We see that nicely with the picture from your textbook as well. Notice the semitendinosus comes down, superficial right here on top, and slightly deep to it, slightly wider, is the flatter semimembranosus sitting right on top, right underneath it. So we have the flatter semimembranosus and the semitendinosus, which is more narrow, right on top. But the exact same origin, exact same insertion, exact same three actions. And these three muscles together, the bicep femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus, collectively form the hamstring.
Professor, you made a differentiation between the insertions of semimembranosus and semitendinosus in the handout. Is that something that we want to be very specific about on the exam?
No. In fact, if we look, let's see if they've given this to us. They haven't. I'm fairly certain I did. Yeah, I don't think they did. Here we go. Perfect. Let's make that a little bigger. Here on the medial aspect of the leg, what I want you to notice, so again, you are absolutely correct. I've used slightly different verbiage because they are slightly offset from each other, but you don't have to be that precise. If you look closely, you will see that not one, not two, not three, but four different muscles all basically insert into the tibia right underneath the medial condyle. So there are four muscles that insert here. Notice on top, we have the semitendinosus. Deep to that, we have the semimembranosus. And we have these two muscles we haven't talked about yet and we'll worry about later. But for all four of these muscles, if you said they inserted into the medial condyle of the tibia, I would be perfectly acceptable with that. In fact, I am very likely, in fact, I will tell you right now that this question, I guarantee you, is in the test bank. Whether or not you'll get it, I don't know, but I guarantee you it is in the test bank. So let's do it. Identify the bone. Really?
The fibula
Fibula?
or tibia.
Tibia. Excellent. I guarantee you on the exam, there is a picture of a tibia. And on that picture of the tibia, there is an arrow that is going to point right here underneath the medial condyle. How do I know that's the medial condyle?
It's medial.
How do you know it's
towards the
medial?
body.
Because the other end gives away, it has a unique structure.
Yeah,
Oh,
what was that unique structure called?
I don't know, I forgot.
The medial malleolus. But you are right, absolutely. I guarantee there's a picture of a tibia. I guarantee that picture of a tibia has an arrow like this. And I ask you to identify all the muscles that insert into this bone feature. And so far, you know two of them, the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. Just out of curiosity, even though we haven't covered it yet, does anybody know what the other two are? Semimembranosus, semitendinosus.
The gracilis,
Gracilis, and
the sartorius.
there you go. All four of those muscles essentially insert into the same location, under the medial condyle of the tibia. So for all of them, you can just say medial condyle of the tibia, and I'll also ask the question the other way around as well. I'll show you a picture of the bone and ask you to identify all the muscles based on this insertion. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. I think we have probably gotten far enough. I think we've covered enough where I think we are good, where we won't have to go too crazy on Thursday to get the rest of it. So we can finish a little bit early. We could try to sneak one more in, but I think we're okay on time. So I think this is a good stopping point. I know your brains are getting full. I know you guys always get punchy when you start getting full. And so this is probably a good stopping point. Let's go ahead and call it a break here. What do you want me to do about going over the homework?
It's basically what we've been doing, right? With kind of with the origins and insertion, but just like writing it down.
No, again, you're not responsible. The drawing of the origins and insertions on the bones, those you are not responsible for turning in. What you are responsible for turning in. So here, hold on. Let's. So again, under your modules, there is a where is it? Muscle activities homework assignment. And with this homework assignment, basically, right, it's doing the things that I've been trying to help you to do. Notice on the first page, I have given you an activity to help you to remember, like our infamous bong rip, right, where it flexes the head, inhales, rotates the head. And we're using that to remember the three actions: flexing the head, elevate the rib cage, right, rotate the head, of the sternocleidomastoid. So what I've given you here are several other activities and generic descriptions of what the action, the motion would be. Your job is to give me which muscle and what the correct names for those actions would be. So I've given you some of these, and many of these are ones that I've used. Hey, look, there's first position of ballet. We just talked about that one today, right? Stuff along those lines. So we've done those. And I also want you to do it the other way around. The second page, I've given you a muscle and what its specific actions are. And your job is to give me an activity, right? So we just finished, for instance, talking today about the Triceps Brachii. What is an activity that you would use that for? We just finished talking about the bicep femoris. I gave you the example of my daughter kicking herself in the back of the leg. You can't use that one. Use something different. But come up with some activity that is going to help you to remember the 2, 3, 4 actions of a muscle to help you to remember it. So this is the homework assignment that I'm talking about that is graded for correctness, that is due on Thursday. So again, it's just the stuff we've been doing in class, basically, coming up with goofy ways to help us to remember what the actions are of these muscles that have 2, 3, 4 actions, so that it helps us to remember and keep them all together. All right.
Thank you for clarifying that.
No problem. I'm not sure what you mean by drawing in the circle.
I think she meant the one where we draw slides. It's optional.
So well, again, well, it's not optional in that I guarantee there's going to be histology slides on the exam. So again, like we've done in all the sections, you are responsible for stuff under the microscope. Absolutely. I made you turn in your very first ones, the epithelial tissues and connective tissues, because you hadn't had an exam yet. And I wanted to make sure to emphasize to you the importance of histology and being familiar with your slides. At this point in the class, you should know that I expect you to know your histology. So the list with the circles is your study guide to tell you precisely what histology you're going to be responsible for. But this is college and you're adults. I don't have to collect it anymore because I know you're going to put the time and effort into doing it, because if you don't, then you're going to get them wrong on the exam. So it's definitely important for you to do. It is on you to do that. But yes, I'm not collecting it anymore. So yeah, because at this point you should know that histology is important and you want to put time and effort into it. All right, so yeah, so okay, I didn't quite get the circle thing. So yeah, so the only thing, I've given you all these handouts to help you to be successful. The bones to draw your origins and insertions, obviously the study guides themselves, the histology list, all of those things, but I'm not collecting any of it. The only thing I'm collecting is that muscle activity handout and the unit review. And those are on Thursday. All right. And again, that muscle activity I'm grading for correctness. So remember, whatever activity you come up with, make sure it includes all of the actions of the muscle, not just 2, not just 3, if it's got 4, but all of them. All right. And like the bong rip, the stupider, the better. Okay. All right. Any questions on that? Excellent. All right. Well, then I will go ahead and call it a day. Good luck. I will see you guys on Thursday. Take care.
Thank you.